Chapter 49. The restaurant that the Fan siblings had chosen was called Wuxia Tavern. It was one of the wealthiest places in the capital, so every noon, there were always rich officials, scholars, and beautiful women who came here to drink and chat. But no one knew where these scholars earned their money, and why these beautiful women were willing to show their faces in public. In any case, the third floor was quiet, and if one did not have the appropriate status, they would not be able to go up. Because everyone knew that those who could sit at the table on the third floor of Wuxia Tavern were people of high status, there were very few conflicts. After all, the capital was not small, but there were many hidden connections in the officialdom. Who knew who was behind them? The one who had just spoken out to refute Fan Xian's theory of peddling things on the street was a true scholar. His name was Zhongwei, and he had always been famous for his talent. He was highly appreciated by the scholars in the capital, so he was a bit arrogant. A few days ago, Zhongwei was reading Dream of the Red Chamber at a friend's place. Although he was very dissatisfied with the meaning of the book, and didn't think there was anything special about the poems, he still admired the author's meticulous effort in writing hundreds of thousands of words. Today, he had come to the restaurant and drunk 2 or 3 cups of yellow wine. He was slightly tipsy, but he heard a few ignorant youths in the room next door talking nonsense about Dream of the Red Chamber. His heart was filled with anger, and he shouted these words. At that moment, the 3 Fan siblings had finished eating and were chatting over tea. Hearing this, Fan Xija thought of his earlier boasting. He thought of how they had criticized Fan Xian, and how he had lost face. He couldn't help but be angry. He was born into the Fan clan, and was extremely noble. He had always run amok on the streets, so he didn't want to be insulted by these pedantic scholars. He lifted the curtain and jumped into the hall on the 3rd floor. Fan Xian thought that since he had just entered the capital, it would be better to keep a low profile. He looked at his sister and asked for her opinion. Fan Ruoruo knew what he was thinking. She smiled and shook her head, indicating that Fan Xija wouldn't go too far. Over the past 2 years, Fan Xija had gradually grown older. Under Fan Ruoruo's advice, he had become more sensible. Smashing and robbing on the streets had basically disappeared, which was why Fan Xija was so relaxed. Fan Xija rushed into the hall and accurately picked out Zhongwei from the crowd. He walked over to the scholar and snorted. "Were you the one who said that? What if I was?" Zhongwei's skin was dark, and his face was prominent. He looked a bit ugly. When he saw someone rushing out from the inner room, he knew that his words had offended someone. However, when he saw the arrogant appearance of the rich and powerful son, his blood rushed to his head. He said coldly, "You're so young, yet you speak so rudely. I wonder which family taught you." Although this gifted scholar he had a wide circle of friends in the capital, he had never met the 12-year-old Fan Xija, so he was very courageous. Fan Xija was just going to scold him a little, but when he heard the word upbringing, he remembered how his mother usually scolded him. He shouted angrily, "You bastard, whose family are you?" Zhongwei had long forgotten his sister's teachings. He jumped up and slapped the man's face. Zhongwei had never expected that someone would dare to be so tyrannical in a place as elegant as Stone Tavern. He hurriedly took half a step back and dodged the slap. The green scarf on his head was torn, and he looked a bit wretched. The people who sat at the same table as Zhongwei were all rather renowned scholars, and there was even a noble character among them. When he saw this situation, he couldn't help but be furious and said, "You dare to be so impudent in broad daylight? Do you still have any respect for the law?" "Law?" Fan Xija snorted. "I am the law." Having said this, he clenched his fists and continued to punch Zhongwei. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the side and grabbed Fan Xija's thin wrist. Fan Xija felt as if his wrist was being held by a red-hot iron band. The pain seeped into his bones. He couldn't help but cry out. "Why aren't you helping me?" he scolded. His bodyguard moved forward to help, but unexpectedly, his figure swayed. 2 palms landed on his chest and abdomen, and he retreated. The one who had grabbed Fan Xija's wrist was the bodyguard of the gloomy man at the table. This bodyguard looked ordinary, but his eyes shone brightly. He was clearly an expert. "Throw this child away. Don't let him disturb Zhongwei's mood," ordered the gloomy man. The expert waved his arm, and Fan Xija was thrown away like a little chick. Fan Xian had thought that Fan Xija would at most argue a little. How could he have known that, in the blink of an eye, the situation had become so serious? But he remembered that his younger brother was young and arrogant. Although Ruoruo said that he had restrained himself, he still couldn't shake off his little debauchee aura. So he thought it would be fine to let him suffer a little. But he had never expected that there would be a master among them, and that this master would be so ruthless. There was a hidden force hidden in that throw. If it wasn't careful, he would end up with broken bones and vomiting blood. No matter how unbearable Fan Xija was, it was a bit too much to use such a method on a 12-year-old child. Somehow, Fan Xian was already outside the door. With a flick of his wrist, he had already grabbed Fan Xija by the collar. Then he used the momentum to turn his body. His right hand twisted clockwise, and Fan Xija began to spin in a circle. 1 circle, 2 circles, 3 circles. Fan Xija's body stopped spinning. His eyes were wide open, and it seemed that he still didn't know what had happened. Fan Xian let go of his hand, and with a bitter smile, handed the still dizzy Xija to Ruoruo. He stepped forward, looked at the expert, and said softly, "My younger brother is young," and offended him. "But for you to be so heavy-handed, you have gone too far." The people at the table with the scholar snorted. They didn't know what to say. After all, what the scholar said was true. Only the gloomy young man drank his wine with some self-restraint. He didn't even look at Fan Xian. After straightening his headscarf, Zhongwei felt that he was in a sorry state. Looking at the beautiful face of the young man in front of him, he felt an inexplicable anger. It seemed that even his smile was repulsive. He said hatefully, "Such a naughty and mischievous child. Why not punish him a little?" Fan Xian ignored him. He smiled warmly at the expert, and then took 2 steps forward. The expert, who had seen Fan Xian twist his wrist and draw a circle to dissipate the force, couldn't help but feel that he was a bit unfathomable. He frowned slightly, and as if to show weakness, he followed Fan Xian's steps and took 2 steps back. The 2 of them took 2 steps back, and the figure of Fan Ruoruo, who was wearing a full veil, was revealed. Fan Ruoruo was famous in the capital, and the people in the restaurant had long heard of her name. A few of them had even seen her from afar at the prince's poetry competition. Among them were some of the children of high-ranking officials. They were all surprised, and greeted her from a distance. It was only now that the people at the table facing Fan Xian knew who the troublemaker was. They couldn't help but feel a bit anxious. When Zhongwei saw Fan Ruoruo, his expression changed slightly, as if he wanted to say something. Chapter 50. Teng Zijing hurried up from downstairs. Seeing the scene, he frowned and whispered something into Fan Xian's ear. Only then did Fan Xian realize that the man was Guo Baoquan, the only son of the Minister of Rites, Guo Yu. He was now a palace and had a bit of a reputation. When the gloomy-faced young man saw Fan Ruoruo, his eyes revealed an expression that Fan Xian loathed. "I was wondering which family could be so tyrannical. So it's the son of Count Sinan." Count Sinan had always been favored by the emperor, but his official position was only that of an assistant minister, of the 4th rank. Moreover, the children of ordinary officials had no idea of the hidden power of the Fan family. Fan Xian didn't want to make a big deal out of this. After all, it was Fan Xija who had made the first move. And no matter what, the one who spoke first seemed to be a fan of Dream of the Red Chamber. But hearing such teasing words, he couldn't help but frown. Guo Baoquan's father was a high-ranking official, and he himself was a palace on good terms with the crown prince. As a result, he had developed an arrogant and condescending temperament. When he saw the rumored icy Fan Ruoruo, he became angry and laughed coldly. How laughable! A mere member of the Fan family dares to use his power to oppress others. How disgraceful! He had always called himself a scholar. With a swish, he opened his folding fan with a certain elegance. The scholars next to him were worried. They had offended Count Sinan and didn't know how to deal with it. Hearing Guo Baoquan's words, they hurriedly chimed in, rushing to accuse him of using his power to bully others. None of them felt that they had done anything wrong. Only He Zongwei, who had caused the trouble, became silent. Refined? Fan Xian saw that the other party's words were threatening, and there was no sign of reconciliation. When he heard that word, he couldn't help but have a hint of mockery in his reply. A scholar cannot be learned without learning, and cannot be learned without ambition. Look at you so-called scholars. Instead of studying in the academy, you come to Yishe Tavern to drink and make merry. What is your aim? Where is your refinement? Apart from Guo Baoquan, the rest of the people at the table were scholars of great talent. When they heard this, their faces changed. A scholar scolded, "Don't think you can use your Fan family's power to speak so impudently." Fan Xian frowned slightly. He had originally thought that his side was not so bold and confident, but seeing the faces of these scholars, he couldn't help but feel disgusted. "You say that the Fan family uses its power to bully others," he said. "I dare not defend myself. On the other hand, all of you are sitting at this table, drinking wine and chatting merrily with the son of the current minister of the imperial court. You are really not afraid of power, and are proud of yourselves. I really admire you." The meaning behind these gentle words couldn't be any clearer. Everyone in the building quietened down. The people sitting at the same table as Guo Baoquan were furious and were about to argue. Guo Baoquan waved his fan twice and was about to open his mouth to teach this young man a lesson. However, Fan Xian's personality was actually a bit strange. He appeared to be gentle, but once he was unhappy, he liked to make others unhappy. Furthermore, he didn't like to give the other party any leeway to retaliate or talk back. So he didn't wait for the minister of the imperial court's son to speak. He pointed at the fan in Guo Baoquan's hand and smiled. "When I first came to the capital, I saw all the scholars playing around all day. They were all skin and bones, and yet they still had to use a fan to fan themselves. Is that what they call strength of character? That kind of strength of character is something I would never dare to learn." Guo Baoquan had been in and out of the royal palace and was friends with the crown prince. He had never been treated like this. He was so angry that he put away the fan in his hand and slammed it on the table. He was so angry that his whole body shook and he couldn't speak. After the kingdom of Qing was ruled by martial law, it placed great importance on the literary style. Young scholars were everywhere in the capital, and at least 70 to 80% of the people in Yishe Tavern were scholars. And these scholars, which one of them didn't have the evil habit of holding a fan? Hearing Fan Xian's loaded words about strength of character, not only did the people at He Zongwei's table fly into a rage, but everyone else on the third floor also stood up. In reality, Fan Xian had always disliked these so-called scholars. He had a feeling for them, and as someone who had lived two lives, he was naturally more free and unrestrained, so he blurted it out. But now, seeing the strange atmosphere in the tavern, he realized that he seemed to have angered everyone. But there was nothing to be afraid of. He smiled and cupped his hands in salute. For some reason, when the scholars saw the radiant smile on this young man's face, they felt that their anger had dissipated by a large half. But Guo Baoquan's anger did not subside. Gnashing his teeth, he threw his fan on the table and gave the signal to attack. Scholars belittling each other was just a matter of words, and the two sides of this confrontation were the sons of high-ranking officials and aristocratic families. So a dangerous atmosphere began to float in the air. Teng Zijing stared coldly at the expert bodyguard of the Guo family, ready to protect his master at any time. With two pa-pa sounds, the two silhouettes overlapped each other. The wind from their fists rose in all directions, causing the powerless scholars in the tavern to cry out in alarm. In the battles of the rich and powerful in the capital, the servants and bodyguards fought to the death, while the masters watched from the sidelines in a boring game. Very few people would involve themselves in it. But Fan Xian was very different from the sons of the rich and powerful. After Teng Zijing and the expert bodyguard of the Guo family fought, he quietly moved forward. Amidst the rain of moves, he found a fleeting gap, and stretched out his fist. With a crisp bang, the fierce fighting that everyone had expected came to an abrupt end. Fan Xian withdrew his right hand and stood where he was with a smile, as if he had not moved at all. The expert of the Guo family was already crouching on the ground. The bridge of his nose had been broken by that punch. Blood flowed out, and so did tears. Fan Xian was very satisfied with the effect of this punch. Teacher Fei had taught him correctly. Breaking that spot was a pain that even a 9th-level master could not endure. Guo Baoquan saw with his own eyes that his most capable bodyguard had been punched into the ground like a puppy. He turned pale with fright and pointed at Fan Xian. In a trembling voice, he said, You dare to bully me with numbers." Fan Xian glanced at him and shook his head, feeling a little baffled. When it came to fighting, of course they had to do it together. He was not a bored swordsman in the Jianghu. He took Ruoruo's hand behind him and confidently walked down the stairs. It never occurred to him that his previous actions were completely against some of the established rules of this world. Chapter 51. Everyone in the building was dumbstruck and speechless. They had seen fights before, but they had never seen a son of a noble family enter the fray. Even if someone had been lucky enough to see such a rare scene, they had probably never seen such a fair and square 2-on-1 fight. Even Teng Zijing was a little depressed. Although he was much weaker than the master of the Guo family, the young master's actions had made him lose face. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat. He thought of the comical scene from before. How could the young master see through such a complicated situation so clearly? Furthermore, that punch seemed to be messing around, but in reality, the power and angle were terrifyingly accurate. When he looked at Fan Xian again, there was a hint of awe and amazement in his eyes. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, the Fan family was about to go downstairs when a private room in the corner of the building was pushed open. A few people came out, presumably having heard the argument outside and had come out to see what was going on. One of them, dressed in luxurious clothing, looked at Fan Ruoruo, and his eyes brightened. He came forward and bowed. "Sister Ruoruo, it's rare to see you out of the manner." The newcomer was handsome, with thick eyebrows and clear eyes, a straight nose and thin lips. He looked like a fine man. Fan Ruoruo bowed in surprise. "The Crown Prince is here too." She quickly introduced Fan Xian to the man. Fan Xian had not expected this to be the Crown Prince of Prince Jing, who was on good terms with his family. Prince Jing and the Fan family had always been on good terms, so he had a good understanding of their family. As soon as Fan Ruoruo introduced him, the Crown Prince immediately guessed who Fan Xian was, and couldn't help but feel slightly surprised. He saw that Fan Xian's speech was neither servile nor overbearing, and that there was an indescribable self-confidence in his bones. The smile on his face was warm and amiable, and he couldn't help but feel very comfortable. At that moment, the palace, Guo Baoquan, also came to pay his respects to the Crown Prince. Someone else told the Crown Prince about the small conflict between the Guo and Fan families. After hearing this, the Crown Prince was greatly interested. He asked Fan Xian, "Brother, you seem to have a problem with scholars. Everyone can study, and everyone is a scholar, Fan Xian replied, bowing to the crown prince. In his mind, there was no concept of class division in this era, and he didn't think that reading a few stereotyped sentences would make him a person who transcended the common people of industry and commerce. I also study, how would I dare to have an opinion about scholars? It's just that, he smiled and continued, I just have a problem with the so-called gifted scholars. As soon as he said this, everyone in the building revealed a curious expression. They wanted to see what this disciple of a noble family who used black boxing would say. Even the crown prince asked with great interest, Brother, why do you look down on the so-called gifted scholars? The crown prince was rather polite, but because Fan Xian had not formally acknowledged his ancestry, he could only call him brother and not mention anything else. At least, he did not mention his surname. Fan Xian understood the rules of this society very well, and was not angry at all. He smiled and explained, the reason why I have a problem with scholars is because I feel that there is something wrong with the way things are nowadays. It seems that if a scholar is willing to go to a brothel, he will become a scholar. I'm afraid this scholar has too much cosmetics and too little scholarly air. It won't be beneficial to the country, but it will benefit those women instead. Although his words were somewhat bitter, they were not malicious. It sounded more like a joke. The crown prince's heir laughed and the people in the restaurant also laughed. This matter was considered to have been resolved. After all, in the eyes of others, this young master of the Fan family, who had come out of nowhere, seemed to have some friendship with the crown prince. As for Guo Baoquan's side, it seemed that they were no match for Fan Xian in a fight, and they were no match for him in an argument either. They could only reluctantly drop the matter. The crown prince invited Fan Xian in for a drink, but Fan Xian politely declined on the pretext of returning to his manor. They only agreed to meet again the next day, and the Fan family left the restaurant. Just as they left the restaurant and were about to get into the carriage, the scholar named He Zhongwei hurried down. He looked into Fan Xian's eyes and very sincerely thanked him. What are you thanking me for? Fan Xian asked with a smile. He Zhongwei replied with a smile, I have always looked down on the rich and powerful, and I have always prided myself on this. Today, you have pointed it out, and I now know that I just like this feeling. Deep in my bones, I can't get rid of those stereotypes. Fan Xian frowned slightly. He felt that this person's attitude had changed a little too quickly. Although he did not like this seemingly honest scholar, the reason for the conflict was that the other party was fighting for him, the author of Dream of the Red Chamber. Therefore, he smiled and explained, everyone has a cowardly part in their bodies. It's just that they need certain things to force this part out. This is the so-called small part under the scholar's robe. Today, I was just speaking nonsense. I hope you don't take offense. The small part under the scholar's robe? He Zhongwei seemed to be thinking about something. He came to his senses and bowed deeply to Fan Ruoruo, who was standing next to Fan Xian. He then turned around and went upstairs without looking back. Fan Xian saw that the dark-skinned scholar's face seemed to be a little red, and only then did he know what was going on. He looked at his sister with a face full of ridicule, but Fan Ruoruo's face was calm, as if the dark-skinned scholar had never been there. Knowing that He Zhongwei's love was unrequited, Fan Xian did not have much sympathy. In his plans, his sister's future husband did not necessarily have to be a noble, but he had to be someone that his sister liked. After Fan Xian left, Guo Baoquan, He Zhongwei, and the other scholars at the table also left the building. The third floor of the Stone Tavern gradually returned to normal, but the guests at the other tables were still talking about the young master from Fan Manor. They had never heard of such a person in Count Sinan's household, and they all guessed that he was a cousin of Miss Fan. Crown Prince Jing naturally knew of Fan Xian's identity, but he could not speak to the idle people outside the room. He poured himself a cup of wine and slowly drank it. He faintly sighed. Everyone says that the Crown Prince loves literature, and often associates with the upper class. Now it seems that among the people he associates with, there is not a single decent talent. An advisor pondered for a moment. He Zhongwei is a student of Tseng Wenxiang. He will definitely pass the imperial examinations next year. I wonder what he is like. Crown Prince Jing shook his head. This He Zhongwei is talented, but his temperament is. He had actually heard the conversation outside from the side room. At this time, he thought of the comment about his strength of character. He laughed and said, his strength of character is indeed lacking. The advisor also laughed. That illegitimate child that Master Fan has been hiding for over 10 years is quite interesting. Crown Prince Jing patted the fan in his hand. He was about to praise Fan Xian when he suddenly remembered Fan Xian's teasing words. He quickly put the fan back on the table and laughed. That Guo Baoquan relies on his father's power, and because he is on good terms with the Crown Prince, he does not care about fan manner. It is not easy for such a mediocre person to survive until now. Chapter 52. As a member of the royal family, Crown Prince Jing naturally knew of the relationship between His Majesty and the Fan family. He was a little lost in thought as he heard his advisor say, but that Fan Xian came to the capital in a hurry, and today in a restaurant, it's not too flashy, but it's a bit impetuous. Crown Prince Jing waved his hand and said, it's always good for a young man to be a bit impulsive. He spoke as if he didn't have the self-awareness that he was only in his early 20s. Thinking of the friendly smile on the face of the young Fan family, the Crown Prince's lips curled into a smile of admiration. Furthermore, the Fan family is currently planning that marriage. If Fan Xian is too low-key, it's not appropriate. I think that after today, the people of the capital will know that the Fan family has produced a beautiful and clean young master. Suddenly, he came to his senses. He slapped his forehead and said with a smile, when I asked you to be my advisor, we agreed that you were only allowed to help me with my affairs. My father is an idle prince who doesn't care about politics. As his son, I can't be disobedient. Come, come, come. He called out to the people at the table and began to drink. Everyone at the table quickly responded, but in their hearts, they were thinking, if you are really willing to be an idle prince, then why are you so close to the Fan family, and why are you so close to the second prince? After getting into the carriage, it was quiet all the way. After a while, Fan Ruoruo burst into laughter. Fan Xian asked curiously, what's so funny? Fan Ruoruo put her hand on her chest and breathed lightly. After a while, she said, I'm thinking about what you said earlier. It's really mean. What did you say? Fan Xian felt that he had said too much in the restaurant today, completely violating his principles of being low-key. He felt that it was inappropriate. It's that line, every day they play around, they're all skin and bones, and they still use a fan to fan themselves. Is that what they call strength of character? Fan Ruoruo imitated his tone and couldn't help but purse her lips and laugh. Fan Xixia also laughed foolishly, but found that the other two people in the carriage weren't paying much attention to him. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. Strength of character is excellent, but it's not something that only scholars have. Previously, when I saw those so-called scholars looking up at the sky with their nostrils up, I was annoyed. Each and every one of them ate their fill all day long and only knew how to talk and cause trouble. If you have the guts, don't take the imperial examinations and don't sit with that Guoshuahua. When it comes to matters of power and nobility, we should knock them down and step on them. Just putting on a pose really doesn't have any future. Hearing this, Fan Ruoruo couldn't help but laugh. Her brother's tone was different from everyone else's in this world. Perhaps only she could understand the meaning behind it. Just now, Crown Prince Jing was next to us. Older brother must have had some reservations when speaking. Fan Ruoruo really wanted to know what her older brother truly thought of these scholars. No, but my tone is much more gentle. Fan Xian smiled. I'm not opposed to places like brothels, and I don't think a gifted scholar can't go there. But I've always felt that a brothel customer is a brothel customer. If he goes to a brothel and still wants to pretend to be a scholar, then he's just like a prostitute, extremely hypocritical. In her mind, her brother was a true scholar. Didn't his words include himself? Fan Xian laughed. There are no outsiders here. He suddenly looked at his sister. Remember, girl. Marry anyone, but don't marry a scholar. Fan Xian laughed. After all, there are no outsiders here. He suddenly looked at his sister seriously. Remember, girl. Marry anyone, but don't marry a scholar. Fan Xian laughed. There are no outsiders here. He suddenly looked at his sister. Remember, girl. Marry anyone, but don't marry a scholar. That he's own way, what is he doing now? Fan Xizha rushed to answer. He's a student of the Imperial College. He comes from a poor family, but it is said that he is a student of scholar Tseng Wenxiang of the Library of the Virtuous. He's always had a bit of a reputation, and he's composed a few poems. Everyone expects him to be in the top 3 in next year's imperial examinations. Fan Xian frowned and said to his sister, he looks honest, but he's actually very patient and good at acting. I don't like people with that kind of personality. You have to be careful in the future, and try not to interact with him. Ruoruo nodded without hesitation. In her mind, Fan Xian was her brother, her teacher, and the person she could rely on the most. Fan Xian was thinking about that dark-faced scholar called He Zongwei. Since he was already a famous scholar in the capital, if he wanted to join a noble family, he should have many options. If it wasn't for his sister, he wouldn't have had to jump out earlier. Was he trying to leave a good impression? Fan Xian's lips curled into a smile. To be able to discover his identity and position in Ruoruo's heart in such a short time, it seemed that this so-called scholar was not simple. He turned his head and saw Fan Xizha, who was leaning against the window, looking out. Fan Xian felt a slight chill in his heart. He said to Ruoruo, go back to the manor with him later. I'm going to walk around the capital for a while. Fan Xizha turned his head from the window, his face a little blank. Fan Xian looked at his face and thought of how he had faced assassination attempts when he was 12 years old. He also thought of the fact that the man was only a 12-year-old child and had been dragged into these dangerous things. He couldn't help but sigh. You're so young. I really don't know what to say. Fan Xizha hid behind his sister in fear. He had always been bold, but for some reason, every time he saw the gentle smile on Fan Xian's face, he felt a little afraid. What are you talking about? Fan Xian had originally thought that the conflict in the restaurant had been deliberately provoked by the young man in front of him in order to expose a very bad side of himself in front of Crown Prince Jing. He knew that the opinion of Crown Prince Jing would play a role in the future inheritance of the Fan Manor, because he was the one who had chosen the restaurant, and he was the one who had caused the trouble. But now, seeing the blank expression on Fan Xizha's face, he couldn't help but doubt his own judgment. Could it be that everything that had happened in the restaurant was just a coincidence? The carriage slowly moved forward. Fan Xian knew that of the 6 guards who had accompanied him and his sister, at least 2 of them were from the Lu family, so he didn't say anything. Fan Ruoruo had been calm the whole time. She lowered her head in silence, thinking of the things that had happened at home and feeling a little depressed. The carriage arrived at the main street in front of the Fan Manor. Ruoruo led her brother back to the manor, while Fan Xian continued his one-day tour of the capital. Fan Ruoruo had wanted to go with him, but thinking of what he had to do later, he could only smile and decline. He looked at Fan Xizha again and told him not to tell anyone about Dream of the Red Chamber, but he wasn't sure if he would listen. Teng Zijing sat in the carriage, looking at his young master. He didn't know when, but Teng Zijing had decided that he would have a bright future if he followed this 16-year-old young master. Perhaps it was because the spring in Danzhou made one's imagination go wild, or perhaps he had been influenced by the young man in front of him, or perhaps the two of them had reached some sort of agreement. Fan Xian thought for a moment, then rested his chin on his hand. I asked my father to bring you here. I don't think you'll have a chance to make a name for yourself in the near future. Don't blame me. Teng Zijing smiled and replied respectfully, young master is not an ordinary person. Of course, following the young master will bring benefits. Fan Xian laughed. What's so unusual about me? Earlier in the restaurant, I was just like any other ignorant teenager, spitting all over the place. Teng Zijing tried to figure out what Fan Xian meant, and carefully replied, young master, I understand what you're saying. I don't think this has anything to do with the young master. The carriage had already stopped, and a cool breeze blew in through the curtains, making one feel refreshed. Fan Xian looked at Teng Zijing and said gently, I also hope this has nothing to do with him. Chapter 53. Along the way, Fan Xian had arranged for Teng Zijing to sit in his carriage, so these words were not hidden from him. Frowning, he said, this is too much of a coincidence. I had just arrived in the capital, and I shouldn't have gotten into a fight with anyone. Yet Xia followed me all day, and when the fight broke out in the restaurant, Crown Prince Jing happened to be there. This kind of coincidence is hard to explain. Teng Zijing laughed. The young master may be rude and unreasonable, but he is not a bad person. The second wife would not dare let him handle such a thing. He continued, the second wife only has one son, and he is not good at studying or martial arts. All he does is eat and drink and go around showing off. So the second wife looks down on him. A bitter smile appeared on Fan Xian's lips. It's precisely because she knows her son can't be helped that Lady Lu is so cruel to me. Mothers seem to be very stubborn. Lady Lu, she wants the outside world to think that the illegitimate son of the Fan family is just an incompetent hedonistic son. Teng Zijing said, perhaps you don't know this, but whenever the young master goes out, he always causes trouble. So the second wife has him follow you out. She doesn't need to make any arrangements, and you will naturally get caught up in the fight. So you mean that if I go out with him, I will naturally become a hedonistic son in the eyes of the world? Correct. Teng Zijing smiled. The second wife's idea is simple, but it seems to be very effective. Fan Xian laughed. This Lady Lu is very interesting. She actually thinks that Xia is a black ink pot, and that she might as well mix them together. Interesting, interesting. I just didn't expect Crown Prince Jing to be in the restaurant, Teng Zijing replied. Teng Zijing replied, young master, you handled the situation appropriately. Although your words seem to have offended some of the scholars, all scholars are proud and aloof. The people of the capital may think that you are arrogant, but it is better than thinking that you are incompetent. Is creating public opinion really that important? Fan Xian laughed. Is the Fan family really that popular? Is Lady Lu really that simple-minded as a pure woman? He looked at Teng Zijing. These are all problems, but they are not my problem. Teng Zijing asked curiously, young master, what is your problem? Fan Xian's beautiful face was distressed. My problem is, to this day, I still don't know what my fiancée looks like, and whether or not she's really sick to death. The carriage stopped at an alley on the side of Tianhe Street. Looking into the distance, the government offices of the various departments were still open for business. The eaves of the buildings were like phoenixes, pointing to the sky. At the furthest point, there was a square house with nothing special, standing there, looking very gloomy. Fan Xian did not let Teng Zijing follow him. Although it seemed that Teng Zijing had already made up his mind to bet his future on Fan Xian knew that he was not Song Qili. He did not have the ability to subdue people. After all, Teng Zijing was his father's personal follower, so there were some things that Fan Xian could not let him know. In front of a stall selling tanhulu, he confirmed the location of the Overwatch Council. He bought a stick and chewed on it as he walked, chewing on it until his teeth were about to fall off. It was so satisfying. Passing by a bookstore, he walked in and looked around. He found that it was filled with historical collections that had been read countless times. He called over the clerk and asked in a low voice, "Do you have Story of the Stone?" A strange smile appeared on the clerk's face, and he replied in a very low voice, "Please follow me, sir." There was no need to avoid people. In a small compartment next to the main hall, the clerk took out a set of books and handed them to Fan Xian. Fan Xian took a look. It was exactly the same as the one he had bought from the auntie earlier that day. He nodded in satisfaction and paid for the book. "Leave the books here. Someone from Fan Manor will come to pick them up later." The first book had already been taken back to Fan Manor by his sister. These books were too heavy for him, so Fan Xian planned to have the servants come to pick them up later. The clerk was troubled. Which Fan Manor? Count Sinan's manor. Fan Xian wondered if there were more Fan Manors. He really didn't know. The Fan clan was a large clan in the capital, and Count Sinan was only a concubine. It was only in the last decade or so that because of the old lady, they had flourished and become the most famous of the Fan clan. The clerk replied respectfully, wrapped up the books, and put them on the counter. Fan Xian casually asked a few more questions about how the book was selling. After getting the answers, he cursed the bootleg bookseller in his heart. Seeing that the customer did not leave immediately after buying the books, the clerk could only smile and chat with him. During this question and answer, the tip of Fan Xian's ears moved imperceptibly. As he smiled and chatted with the clerk, he slowly circulated his zhenqi. His hearing suddenly became more acute, and he immediately found the sound he was looking for in the quiet environment of the bookstore. Their breathing was different from that of the common people. The breathing sounds were long and distant, and it was obvious that they were people with zhenqi. Fan Xian knew that these were people sent by his father to protect or monitor him, and he frowned. The clerk saw the customer suddenly frown. Although he felt that the frown of this beautiful young man was also very beautiful, he thought that he had said something wrong and couldn't help but feel uneasy. Leaving the bookstore through the back door, Fan Xian confirmed that he had successfully shaken off the two attendants behind him. He felt a little proud of himself, thinking about the things he had learned from Fei Jie when he was young. Apart from using poison, he had also learned anti-stalking skills. They had finally come in handy. He followed the crowd on Tianhe Street, walking along the flagstones, looking at the buildings on both sides of the street. These buildings were ancient, especially in front of them. On each side of the road was a gentle stream of water. If one wanted to get to the yamen from the road, they would have to cross the small wooden bridge over the stream. The water was as smooth as a mirror, reflecting the shadow of the bridge and the branches of the green trees that stretched over the water. It looked very serene and beautiful. Occasionally, petals from the peach blossom bushes in the distance would be blown off by the wind, floating on the water. He walked along the side of the road, looking at the falling water under his feet. A satisfied smile appeared on his lips. In the few days he had been in the capital, he had always thought about complicated things. It was a far cry from his original intention of experiencing life, and his mind was a little tired. Now that he had been refreshed by the capital's spring scenery, he suddenly felt much better. Arriving at the entrance of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian frowned as he looked at the limestone building. He felt that this yamen was a little too ugly, and did not match the antique buildings around it. But when he thought of Fei Jie's ugly face, he had no choice but to admit it. It was true that the building suited the person. Walking into the building, Fan Xian found it strange that the officials and passers-by all around him were looking at him. Or rather, they were looking at him with strange eyes. He carefully looked at himself to make sure that there was nothing that could attract attention, and then he raised his head, but the curious gazes around him did not change. Chapter 54. Grabbing hold of a passing scribe, Fan Xian looked at his lifeless face. For some reason, Fan Xian felt a little nervous, but at the same time, he felt a sense of familiarity. It was as if he had found the old comrade Fei Jie. He smiled sweetly and greeted him. "Hello." The owner of the lifeless face, like the rest of the people in the Overwatch Council, looked at Fan Xian with a strange expression. After a while, he said, "Hello." These two words were said a little stiffly. Fan Xian swallowed and smiled. "This is very presumptuous of me, but why is everyone staring at me?" The man laughed, revealing his pale white teeth. He found this young man with a shy smile very interesting. He asked, if a stranger suddenly appeared in a place where no stranger had ever entered, wouldn't everyone stare at him? Fan Xian suddenly understood, but then he was confused. Isn't this the Yamen of the Overwatch Council? Has no stranger ever come to the government to handle official business? The man pointed outside the door and kindly explained, "Look over there." Fan Xian took a look and saw that there was no one at the entrance of the Overwatch Council. The people on the street were walking along the other side of the street. The man laughed, but it was a horrifying smile. The old skin on his cheeks wrinkled together. The people of the capital have always avoided our Yamen. As for official business, we, the Overwatch Council, never handle official business. His Majesty has decreed that the other 6 Yamens are not allowed to get involved in the affairs of the Council, so we have never had any dealings with the other Yamens. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. So that's how it is. It seems that I really am a reckless trespasser. The man asked curiously, "You don't know what the Overwatch Council does?" Fan Xian replied, "I know a little." After all, he was a student of Fei Jie of the 3rd Bureau of the Overwatch Council. He knew a little about the Overwatch Council's functions. "And yet you dared to barge in like this." The man shrugged. "Most people would think of this place as Yama's palace." Fan Xian smiled helplessly. "Perhaps it's because I saw Yama when I was very young?" The man laughed and patted his shoulder. "Very good, very good." The skin on Fan Xian's right shoulder under his clothes grew a little goosebumps. He felt that the man's tone was like Sun Ernyang's. "Is there anything I can help you with?" The man smiled. Fan Xian immediately felt as if the man had turned into a hotel receptionist from his previous life who spoke in English. He shook his head to get rid of this untimely distraction. He took out a piece of silver from his sleeve and handed it over. "Is Fei Jie here?" he asked politely. The man was stunned. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Immediately after, Fan Xian noticed that the man's expression was no longer indifferent, but respectful with a hint of fear. "Are you looking for Master Fei?" As he said this, he flicked his finger beautifully, sending the silver pieces Fan Xian had stuffed into his sleeve back into Fan Xian's sleeve. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows. He knew that while this move seemed simple, it was actually very beautiful. At the very least, he had been immersed in martial arts for over a decade to be able to be so accurate. Only now did he realize that this seemingly ordinary Overwatch Council official was actually a hidden ace. Fan Xian nodded, admitting that he had come to find Fei Jie. He then noticed that the man was vigorously wiping the right hand that had patted his shoulder. "Master Fei is not here," the man replied politely. He discreetly took a few steps back, putting some distance between himself and Fan Xian. "Master Fei has gone to the border to supervise." Fan Xian slapped his forehead. Only now did he remember that Teng Zijing had said that the director of the Overwatch Council would be returning home for at least 3 months. Given Fei Jie's lazy temper, the only person who could control him was not here, so naturally he would slip away. He excused himself from the man and prepared to leave. Before he left, Fan Xian suddenly smiled and asked, "Sir, what is your name?" "I am Wang Qinian." The Overwatch Council official, Wang Qinian, saw that this young man, with a slightly bashful smile, dared to come to the Overwatch Council alone and call Master Fei Jia by his name. He knew that this young man was no ordinary person, so he called himself I. Fan Xian knew that when the man heard that he was looking for Fei Jia, he unconsciously associated him with something dangerous like poison. That was why he wiped his hand and retreated. He looked at Wang Qinian with a smile. If Master Fei returns, please inform him that his student has come to the capital. Fei Jia's student? Wang Qinian felt the urge to chop off his own right hand. He silently cursed himself for his fondness for touching things. He coughed and agreed. Walking out of the Overwatch Council's main gate, the sun shone down through the tall trees on either side of the road. The shadows of countless leaves enveloped Fan Xian's body. He walked west for a while and sat on the railing next to the running water. He rested his hands on the sides of his body and looked at the crowd on the street. For a moment, he didn't know where to go. He didn't want to go back to Fan Manor. Although there was a gentle and kind sister there, when he thought of Lady Lu, his father, and that chubby boy who should have been happily studying every day but was now forced to compete with him, he felt a little uncomfortable. What belonged to him, he bravely fought for it. He would not give up. However, Fan Xian was still not sure what truly belonged to him in this world. After all, he had experienced another life before, and there was always a sense of distance between him and this world. He hid the fact that he had come to the Overwatch Council to find Fei Jia from his father. Although his father knew that Fei Jia was his teacher, Fan Xian still felt that Fei Jia was more trustworthy. Perhaps it was because he had not been in this world for long, and had begun following old Fei around looking for corpses, which gave him a sense of closeness. Fei Jia's teacher was not in the capital. This fact made the arrangements he had made before entering the capital a little problematic. So he was thinking about what he should do next. As he thought about these things, he jumped down from the railing and began to walk back. When he passed by the Overwatch Council again, he noticed that the people on the street were indeed walking on the right side of the street, avoiding the council's main gate. It was as if they were afraid of the sinister aura that seeped out of the building. He squinted at the entrance of the building. The thin clouds in the sky suddenly parted, and the clear sunlight shone down. His eyes were blinded by a golden light. Rubbing his eyes, he looked towards the golden light, and found that there was a wide tablet in front of the Overwatch Council. It looked like a crouching tiger crouching on the ground. The tablet was made of stone, and a few words were written on it. Fan Xian frowned. He felt that these words were somewhat familiar, as if he had seen them somewhere before. But no matter how hard he thought, he couldn't figure out where they had come from. His gaze moved downwards, and he saw the inscription. It was a somewhat unfamiliar, but incomparably familiar name. Chapter 55. Yi Qingmei. Fan Xian was incomparably shocked. Unconsciously, he quietly said the name. He could never have imagined that his mother's name would appear on the stone tablet in front of the Overwatch Council. His face remained calm, but his heart was in turmoil. Why would his mother's name appear on the stone tablet in front of the Overwatch Council? Although Miss Yi had been the wealthiest woman in the world, she could not have enjoyed such treatment that not even the emperor could. Furthermore, his mother's mysterious death must have had something to do with the nobility of the kingdom of Qing. Although Wu Zhu had said that the Yi family's enemies had all been killed in the storm 10 years ago, who could guarantee that the relatives of those enemies were not left behind in the court? Even now, Yi Qingmei was clearly a taboo name. The Yi family's wealth had all been transferred to the palace treasury, and the Yi family's business had become royal merchants. The Overwatch Council had brazenly put Yi Qingmei's name in front of their door. Although Wu Zhu had said that few people in the world knew that his mother was called Yi Qingmei, the royal family of the kingdom of Qing must have known. Director Chen was a bit too bold. Did he not care about the royal family's reputation? However, after seeing the short stone tablet, Fan Xian finally understood what Uncle Wu Zhu had said in Danzhou. Not many people know that the young lady was called Yi Qingmei. The people around her just call her young lady. But the name Yi Qingmei, even now, is very famous in the capital. Fan Xian rubbed his hands and walked forward with his head down. He thought that with such a tablet in front of the Overwatch Council that everyone in the capital feared, it would be difficult for the name Yi Qingmei not to be famous. All these mental activities happened in a very short period of time. He restrained the expression on his face, pulled up his sleeves, and expressionlessly walked east, as if he did not see the name. It was because he saw the tablet that Fan Xian could not help but think of the Prime Minister's daughter he was about to marry. According to his father, her mother, the eldest princess, was now in charge of the Yi family's business. If there was anything in this world that he felt he should have, this business would be at the top of the list. It was a very strange feeling. From Tingzijing, Fan Xian had already found out where Miss Lin lived. But knowing her background and identity, and knowing that the capital was a place of hidden dragons and crouching tigers, he did not dare to sneak off to spy on her. He had come to the Overwatch Council to find teacher Fei Jie. He wanted to use the Overwatch Council's heaven-defying methods to find a way to meet the woman who was entangled in Mion's sickbed. At the same time, he wanted to ask Fei Jie to help take a look at the girl's condition. Unexpectedly, Fei Jie was not in the capital. Fan Xian was a little annoyed. Did he really have to wait until they consummated their marriage to find out what Fei Jie looked like? No, he warned himself. He had to find a way to peep. If something went wrong, he would have time to prepare for his escape. As he walked, Fan Xian became even more annoyed. He had just arrived in the capital, and he was completely unfamiliar with the roads. He walked back and forth on Tianhe Avenue twice, but he couldn't find where his family's carriage was. Coincidentally, he saw a child holding a stick of candied hawthorn and was chewing on it as he walked. Taking a whiff of the sweet smell, Fan Xian felt it to be very familiar. He rushed forward, snatched it, and took a bite. Based on the taste, he confirmed that it was from the same stall as the one he had eaten before. Only then did he ask where the stall was. The child was frightened. He thought he had run into a candied hawthorn robber. Finally, Fan Xian calmed down with 2 copper coins and pointed him in a direction. Fan Xian followed the direction and walked for a long time. Sadly, he found that the child was taking revenge on him. This place was clearly not where he should be. He was already at the edge of the capital. Fan Xian did not know this, otherwise he would have been very proud of the strength of his legs and sad about his intelligence. This place was very desolate. There was a temple. In the bustling capital, to find such a desolate place was not an easy task. To say it was desolate was not accurate. To be precise, it was unusually clean. Not a speck of dust could be seen on the pillars and eaves of the temple. He raised his head to look at the black wooden structure in front of him. He couldn't help but think of the Temple of Heaven in his previous life in Beijing. The temple in front of him was much smaller. It seemed to have less of a mysterious connection to the heavens, and more of a worldly elegance. The front door was painted dark black. It looked very dignified. On the door was a flat horizontal board with the words, Temple of Qing, written on it. Fan Xian licked the sugar off his teeth. Looking at the 2 sacred yellow words above his head, an indescribable feeling welled up in his heart. This was the Temple of Qing. According to legend, the only place in the kingdom of Qing that could communicate with the illusory temple, the temple where the royal family worshipped heaven. Back in Danzhou, Fei Jie had said that the Temple of Heaven was 3 li away from the palace in the capital. Fan Xian had always thought it was 3 li away from the palace. He had no idea that 3 li away was actually a place. Fan Xian's mouth fell open. Before he came to the capital, he had thought that since no one in this world could find the temple, he had to go to the Temple of Heaven to take a look. He didn't know if he could find the answer to the question that had been haunting him for 16 years. Why did he come to this world? In the novels he read in his previous life, Xiang Xiaolong had a reason. Later on, the transmigrators also had a reason. Later on, there was no need for a reason. But Fan Xian himself was deeply puzzled. He needed a reason. A reason that could explain why he had been reborn into this world when he was clearly dead. He had never imagined that the child's random directions would lead him to the Temple of Qing. This realization made him feel slightly dizzy. Perhaps there was some kind of mysterious connection between him and the temple. There was some kind of miraculous fate. He firmly believed in this. He firmly believed in the fate brought about by a stick of Tanghulu. Stepping forward, Fan Xian was surrounded by silence. He gently pushed open the heavy wooden door that seemed to have not been opened for many years. Stop! A loud shout came. Chapter 56. Fan Xian was startled. He had thought this place was sacred and quiet, but suddenly there was such a roar. Looking carefully, he realized that there was someone inside the temple. The person blocking his way was a middle-aged man with sunken eyes and a hooked nose. He looked very sinister. Seeing the man staring at him, Fan Xian felt a little unhappy. He thought about the classics and history he had read. According to the rules of the royal city, the Temple of Qing was a place that everyone could come to. Not only did this man hide behind the door to scare people, but he also put on a posture like an eagle hunting a rabbit. Who the hell would want to be a rabbit? Fan Xian frowned. Sir, your voice is so loud. Are you not afraid of deafening us? Unexpectedly, the middle-aged man's expression was unusually serious. He pushed Fan Xian forward and said in a low voice, "Leave quickly. There are people in the temple who are praying. Do not disturb them." The man was clearly dressed as a follower of a wealthy family, but his tone was very official. Fan Xian did not notice this. Ever since he had dug graves with Teacher Fei as a child, he had developed a slight obsession with cleanliness. Seeing the hand coming closer and closer, he frowned and crossed his hands, twisting them around the man's wrist. There was a light snap. The two men, one big and one small, looked at each other in surprise. They found that their methods were very similar. It was like two snakes intertwining, unable to tear each other apart. The middle-aged man let out a light sound. His eyes shone brightly, and a hidden force flowed out like a great river, attacking Fan Xian's body from his wrist. Fan Xian grunted. He had not expected to run into such an expert. He felt a burning sensation on his back, and the tyrannical Zhenqi that had been quiet for many years reacted in an instant. It shot out from his dantian and met the man's attack head-on. There was a soft hum. The dust on the stone steps was blown up by the collision of the two hidden forces, forming a strange gray ball that quickly dispersed. The two men were shaken several steps apart. The middle-aged man covered his mouth and coughed. Fan Xian's face was expressionless, as if there was no problem. The middle-aged man looked at him coldly. So young, and yet you have such tyrannical Zhenqi. Which family are you from? Why do you care who I am? I only want to enter the temple to pray. What right do you have to stop me? Fan Xian looked at him coldly. There is a noble in the temple. Young man, wait for a moment. The middle-aged man felt that his opponent's technique was similar to his own. He thought that his opponent might be a disciple of some great family in the capital, and that he was acquainted with him. That was why he gradually dispersed the killing intent in his heart. A hint of a smile flashed in Fan Xian's eyes. In the laws of the Kingdom of Qing, there is no rule stating that one needs to line up to worship the temple. The middle-aged man furrowed his brows. He felt that this young man was very annoying. With a wave of his sleeve, he entered the temple, leaving Fan Xian outside. Fan Xian opened his mouth to speak, but his chest felt stuffy and his throat tasted sweet. He quickly pulled out a handkerchief from his sleeve and covered his mouth. Fortunately, at the critical moment when the hidden forces collided, his right index finger quietly flicked the opponent's pulse. It was all because his understanding of the human body structure was more profound than that of these martial arts masters. Otherwise, he was afraid that he would have suffered more serious injuries. At this moment, when he looked at the heavy wooden door again, there was an additional trace of fear in his eyes. He no longer dared to try to push this seemingly immovable door. Fan Xian coughed twice. A trace of determination appeared on his handsome face. Since he could not beat the opponent, he could only retreat and wait for another day to fight. Just as he turned to leave, he found that the wooden door behind him had opened again. The middle-aged master who had injured him stood at the door and said coldly, "The master has ordered that the young man should go to the side hall to pray. Do not enter the main hall." After saying this, he added, "Do not enter the main hall. Do you hear me?" Fan Xian turned around and looked at the middle-aged man. He then looked at the seemingly unfathomable and eerie temple of Qing. His brows furrowed, and with a wave of his sleeves, he stepped over the high threshold and walked in the direction of the side hall without turning his head. Seeing that the young man, after this setback, was still unhurried and unafraid, and still persisted in his original goal, a trace of admiration flashed in the middle-aged master's eyes. The middle-aged man closed the temple door and furrowed his brows as he looked around. These little bastards actually let the young man walk to the temple door. He had to train them well when he returned tonight. The temple of Qing was a quiet place. The people of Qing were a very realistic people. If the common people wanted to pray, they would rather go to the Dongshan temple to the west of the capital to pray to the child-giving goddess and the immortals who looked like rich landlords. But the people of Qing respected and feared the heavens. The emperor was the so-called son of heaven, so the temple of Qing became a place for the royal family to worship the heavens. Although the temple of Qing was still open to the common people of the capital, no common people liked the heavy pressure of the strict atmosphere. The main hall of the temple of Qing was the building that looked like the temple of heaven. It had 2 layers of round eaves, and was very beautiful. The middle-aged man stood respectfully outside the main hall, looking at the nobleman who was holding his hands behind his back and admiring the colorful paintings on the wall. He said in a low voice, according to the master's wishes, the young man should go to the side hall. The nobleman was about 40 years old. His face could not be said to be heroic, but his eyes had a disdainful expression. It was only a trace of exhaustion that was difficult to detect. "Which family does that young man belong to be able to exchange blows with you?" the nobleman asked with a smile. The middle-aged man was very skilled in martial arts, but in front of the nobleman, he really was like a follower. He answered honestly, "I do not know. I just reported to the master. The way he walks is similar to the way of the guards in the family." The nobleman was a bit surprised. "Oh? Could it be the boy from the Li family?" The middle-aged man smiled bitterly. "Although I have always been too lazy to deal with people, I still know Crown Prince Jing." "Oh." The nobleman made another sound and turned his head to look at the frescoes on the wall. He had too many things to consider every day, and it was rare for him to have such leisure time. He did not want to be disturbed by such trivial matters. Earlier, he had allowed the young man to enter the side hall to pray purely because he felt that it was a good thing for the country to have more young talents. The middle-aged man quietly stood guard outside the hall, his eyes occasionally glancing at the side hall. After a long time, there was a commotion outside the hall. The nobleman suddenly frowned. Why is the girl not resting in the back? What is she doing in the side hall? The middle-aged man was slightly surprised. He used all his strength to listen in that direction. He raised his head in shame. The princess has gone to the side hall. The nobleman frowned. Nonsense. He suddenly thought of something, and his expression changed slightly. "Go take a look. Also, bring that young man to me." "Yes." The middle-aged man accepted the order and was about to leave. Suddenly, there was the sound of a bird outside the temple of Qing. The temple door was pushed open, and a hurried man ran in. He handed the nobleman a sealed letter. Chapter 57. Fan Xian walked in the direction of the side hall with his head down. Out of the corner of his eye, he looked at the altar of heaven in the main hall. He was curious as to who was praying there, to be able to order around that middle-aged master. He knew that the person's background was unfathomable, and he only wanted to come to the temple of Qing to take a look, so there was no need to fight over this, even though his name was Fan Xian. His right hand was still covering his mouth, and he coughed occasionally. Earlier, he had used Jinqi to travel around his abdomen and confirmed that his body had not suffered any substantial damage. It was just that when the Jinqi had reversed, it had ruptured the fragile membrane between his throat, not his lungs or upper bronchial tubes. He coughed as he walked. Looking at the spots of blood on the white handkerchief, he thought of Lin Daiyu, Su Mengzhen, Zhou Yu, Lin Qinnan, and many other elders. Forget about Lin Qinnan. She was not as poignant as the other three. By the time he reached the side hall, his Jinqi had already healed most of the small injury. Fan Xian regretfully put away the handkerchief, looked back at the altar of heaven, and walked into the side hall. The side hall was a slightly smaller temple, surrounded by a green stone wall. There was no one inside. Fan Xian found that he did not see the legendary ascetic monks, and felt slightly disappointed. He walked into the hall and was even more disappointed to find that there were no statues of the gods he had seen in his previous life. But thinking about it, this was normal. Since they were worshipping the sky, no one would know what the sky looked like. In the middle of the temple, there was an incense burner. It was very wide, and there was a light yellow satin hanging down to the ground, covering the green stone floor below. On top of the incense burner was an exquisite porcelain incense burner. There were 3 sticks of incense stuck in the burner, and most of the incense sticks had already burned away. The entire room was enveloped in a calming fragrance. Fan Xian wandered around the hall, his eyes sweeping over the colored paintings on the walls. He found that the style of the paintings was very similar to the oil paintings of later generations. But the gods in the paintings, standing on mountain peaks, floating on the surface of the sea, or sitting on volcanoes, did not have real faces. They were slightly blurry and deformed, as if the painter had purposely arranged them this way. He took a look and found that these murals only talked about ancient myths that had been mentioned in the scriptures. Among them, there was content about Yu the Great controlling the flood. There were also some other things. However, no matter how Fan Xian looked at them, they did not match up with the scriptures. He shook his head and gave up on the idea of finding some answers from the incense burner. He found a prayer mat at the side of the hall and threw it in front of the incense burner. He ran down, put his palms together, closed his eyes, and faced the green smoke curling up from the incense burner. His lips moved slightly as he prayed incessantly. In his previous life, Fan Xian was naturally an atheist. In this life, Fan Xian was a firm believer in theism. This change happened very naturally. Anyone who encountered such a strange experience would probably have the same psychological change as him. That was why he knelt and prayed piously, hoping that the ethereal heavens and the traceless temple would be able to explain why he had come to this world. At the same time, he prayed even more piously for the heavens to give him a lot of silver and a very peaceful life. The seemingly tangible green smoke suddenly dissipated. The tip of Fan Xian's ears trembled slightly, as if he had heard something. He opened his eyes in disbelief and looked at the small, slightly trembling porcelain burner on the incense burner. He was incomparably shocked. Could it be that his seemingly pious, but actually absent-minded prayer had actually been detected by the heavens? His gaze rested on the wide incense burner, and Fan Xian finally discovered the root of the problem. A bright light flashed through his eyes. His left hand pressed against the boot that concealed the dagger. Slowly but firmly, he extended his right hand and pulled back the cloth that hung below the incense burner. After the cloth was pulled back, what fell into Fan Xian's eyes was a scene that made him very surprised. A girl wearing a white dress with the right hem was squatting in a corner of the incense burner, looking at Fan Xian in surprise. The girl's eyes were very large and soft, like the surface of a quiet lake that would make one fall into a deep sleep forever. Her facial features were exquisite and beautiful, with light pink skin and long eyelashes. She looked like someone walking out of a painting. Fan Xian was startled, and his gaze rested on her face. Gradually, he realized that the girl's forehead was a little big, her nose was a little sharp, and her skin was a little too white. Her lips seemed to be a little thicker than the average beauty's, and there were still many imperfections. But when put together, coupled with a slightly timid expression and a natural shyness, Fan Xian's heart still moved. He was moved. The girl looked curiously at this young man who was piously praying to the heavens. She realized that his face was unexpectedly beautiful, elegant and otherworldly. Even his eyelashes were so long. She couldn't help but stare at him a few more times. After looking, the girl felt that something was wrong. A faint red smear quickly spread across both sides of her cheeks and then quickly spread. Unexpectedly, even the roots of her ears had turned red. But she still couldn't bear to look away. She was curious in her heart. Whose family was this young man outside, to be so handsome? It was quiet in the corner of the Qing temple. Fan Xian's hand continued to hold that piece of muslin. His gaze continued to linger on the girl's face, and the girl gathered her courage to look at him. They looked at each other like this. After an indeterminable amount of time, it was still silent. Fan Xian's gaze gently brushed over the girl's face. Finally, the girl couldn't help but slowly lower her head. Fan Xian's gaze finally fell on the girl's lips. Only then did he realize that her lips were abnormally shiny. He looked at her again curiously and found the reason. It was the reason that he remembered for a long time after the incident. The girl was holding an oily chicken drumstick in her hand, and the oil on her lips was obviously from eating the drumstick. Such a beautiful and otherworldly woman in white was hiding under the incense table of the Temple of Qing, secretly eating a chicken leg. This strong contrast made Fan Xian's mouth drop open, and he couldn't speak for a long time. After a long time, there was finally a sound in the quiet and awkward silence of the incense table. You, who are you? The beautiful man and woman spoke at the same time. Even their slightly trembling voices were very similar. It was the first time Fan Xian had heard the girl's voice. He felt that it was soft and powerless. It was a very comfortable feeling, but also very confusing. His chest tightened, and he actually spat out a mouthful of blood. Ah! Seeing him spit out blood, the girl was startled, but not because she was afraid. Her eyes naturally showed a strong sense of pity, as if all the pain Fan Xian had suffered was pain in her heart. Seeing her worry for him, Fan Xian's heart warmed. He smiled and comforted her. It's nothing. Vomiting and vomiting will become a habit. Chapter 58. The wind comes from the south, and flies into my bosom. The flower bud in my bosom blooms for a gentleman. The zither and the zither are hard to keep company, and the years press on. Those who give me the papaya will be rewarded with the jasper. Hearing this new witticism, the girl's worried eyes flashed with a hint of a smile. Fan Xian smiled at her and said softly, "Do you still want to hide inside?" The girl shyly shook her head. At that moment, a voice came from outside. "Miss, where did you run off to?" The girl's face darkened. She knew she had to leave. Fan Xian also knew that they must be looking for her. Looking at her expression, he felt a sense of loss, as if afraid that after today's separation, he would never be able to find the girl again. He hurriedly asked, "Will you come back tomorrow?" She shook her head, her expression a little gloomy. "Are you a family member of the nobleman in the main hall?" Fan Xian probed. The girl thought for a moment and smiled. She didn't answer him. Instead, she crawled out of the incense table and ran out like a gust of wind. Before she left the temple, she looked back at Fan Xian and the chicken leg in her hand. She cutely stuck out her tongue, thinking that if her uncle saw this, he would certainly scold her again. She rolled her eyes and ran back, handing the chicken leg to Fan Xian. She smiled and waved her hand, then ran out of the temple. She never came back. Fan Xian blankly knelt on the prayer mat, confirming that the girl he saw earlier was not a fairy sent by heaven. He looked down at the chicken leg in his hand and laughed foolishly. He decided in his heart that even if he had to dig 3 feet into the ground, he would find this girl in the capital. If she wasn't betrothed, no, even if she was betrothed to some bastard from another family, he would still snatch her away. When he walked out of the temple with the greasy chicken leg in his hand, he saw a group of carriages heading east. He knew that the girl in white must be in that group. The setting sun shone on the green trees on both sides of the road, making the leaves look like they were on fire. Fan Xian unconsciously raised the chicken leg and took a bite. He suddenly remembered that the chicken leg had also passed by the girl's fragrant lips, and his heart also burned. Chicken drumstick, oh chicken drumstick. You're the luckiest drumstick in the world to be able to let that lady have a bite of it. He was all smiles as he walked toward the center of the capital. He could not find the way back to Fan Manor, but he was in no hurry. In his heart, he was very grateful to the child who had eaten the candied hawthorn. Not far behind him, there was a blind man who he should be thanking. He was holding a bamboo stick as he disappeared into the twilight. Gong Dian's mood was not as good as Fan Xian's. Today, he had accompanied his master out to relax, but he had not expected so many things to happen on the way. First, that unknown youth had managed to sneak past his subordinates and guards and run into the temple of Qing. Then, that little girl had slipped into the side hall under the watchful eyes of everyone. He really did not know what those old nannies were doing. But he had no place to vent his anger, because the master's face was gloomy, as if he was very angry. It seemed that the encrypted letter had something written that made him very unhappy. Gong Dian. The nobleman in the carriage called coldly. He had never liked to ride in a sedan chair. This was a habit he had developed 20 years ago. If Chen Pingping still does not want to come back, send a team to capture him. Yes. Gong Dian accepted the order, but in his heart, he was secretly complaining. Who could do this job well? Seeing that the carriage had quieted down, Gong Dian let out a secret sigh of relief and relaxed a little. He turned around and saw the dejected guards behind him, which made him furious. Earlier, these guards had been hiding outside the temple of Qing. Who knew that they would all be knocked out, and they could not even see who had done it. And because of this, that youth had been able to so easily enter the heavily guarded temple of Qing. Gong Dian's brows furrowed as he wondered who had the ability to knock out 8 fifth-ranked guards at the same time without making a sound. This was practically the level of the 4 great grandmasters. What if this person was an assassin? His heart was filled with fear, and he did not dare to continue thinking about it. He knew that when he returned, a secret investigation would begin. The last carriage in the line was different from the others. The windows were decorated with elegant flowers. The girl in white, who had awkwardly looked at Fan Xian in the temple of Qing, was now leaning back in her seat. She had a faint smile on her lips, as if she was still thinking about something. The serving girl saw that the young lady was rarely so happy, and her mood lightened. She asked, "Miss, did something good happen today?" The young lady smiled. Every time I come out with my uncle, I'm always happy. At least it's much better than staying in that gloomy room. The serving girl pouted. But the imperial doctor said that the young lady's illness cannot be exposed to the wind. As soon as she heard the word illness, the young lady's expression darkened. She thought of the handsome young man she had met earlier, and her mood improved a little. She thought to herself that she had been born with a bad life, and that she did not have many days left. Should she be happy or sad to meet that person? She then thought of the rumor that involved her, and of that son of Fan Manor. Although her mother was against it, and that strange father seemed to be against it, but who could win against her uncle? Thinking of this, her heart was filled with worry. She felt a sweetness in her chest, and quickly pulled a white handkerchief to her lips. After a few coughs, the handkerchief was stained with blood. Seeing this, the serving girl panicked and said in a sobbing voice, vomiting again. "What should I do?" The young lady smiled faintly. Thinking of what the young man had said, she laughed lightly. "What's wrong with that? You'll get used to it if you keep vomiting." The serving girl made a sound of surprise. She didn't understand what she meant, and thought that the young lady's illness had made her confused. It was late at night when Fan Xian returned to Fan Manor, battered and exhausted. He made up his mind to tie Teng Zijing to his waist whenever he went out. Dinner had already begun in Fan Manor, and 4 people were waiting for him at the table. He was a little embarrassed, but Count Sinan's face was expressionless. Lady Lu was also smiling warmly, without a trace of bitterness. After Fan Xian explained in a low voice, Fan Ruoruo laughed. Her brother was too muddle-headed. Even if he couldn't find his own carriage, he could just hire one from a carriage company. Fan Xian didn't even think about the carriage company, so he could only force a smile and endure Fan Xija's mockery. After dinner, the family of 4 began to play mahjong. Fan Xija was like an accountant, watching from the side with an abacus, helping everyone calculate. A trace of sadness flashed in Lady Lu's eyes, but she suppressed her resentment for her son's failure to live up to her expectations. She smiled and chatted with Fan Xian. Chapter 59. After playing a few rounds, Fan Xian's luck was not good, and he was impatient with Lady Lu being so affectionate, so he gave up his seat and patted Fan Xija. Fan Xija timidly glanced at his father, and Count Sinan nodded slightly. Overjoyed, Fan Xian let out a soft cry and jumped onto the stool. This child was usually timid in front of his father. After eating, he would be forced to study, and he would never be allowed to gamble or play cards. He knew that he was allowed to sit at the table today because his father was in a good mood and wanted to give Fan Xian some face. So Fan Xija had a much better impression of his older brother from Danzhou. Fan Xian wandered around the courtyard, and when he returned to the reception hall, he stared dumbfounded at the table. In front of Fan Xija was a pile of copper coins, while the other 3 families had lost almost all of their money. Thinking back to the day in the carriage, this seemingly naughty little brother of his had displayed an unparalleled passion for wealth. Fan Xian finally realized that his little brother was not completely useless. At least when it came to making money, he seemed to have some talent. He stood curiously behind Fan Xija, carefully observing how this 12-year-old boy operated. After watching for a while, he couldn't help but be in awe. He saw that this kid's hands were extremely nimble. He could actually count the tiles with one hand, grab them, draw them, play them, knock them, eat them, win them. His other hand was on the abacus, and his 5 fat fingers plucked at the beads on the abacus, making a popping sound. Fan Xija won all the bets, and the method of calculating the pawns was very complicated, so Fan Xija was the one doing the counting. Fan Xian watched from the side. He always felt that this kid could calculate a lot of money. No wonder there were so many copper coins in front of him. Seeing that Fan Xian was staring at Fan Xija, Lady Lu's expression did not change. She sighed inwardly, thinking that her son's ugly greed for money had been seen by Fan Xian. She was afraid that he would become even more confident. She had no idea how shocked Fan Xian was, because Fan Xian could not see a trace of arrogance or mischief on Fan Xija's face. Instead, there was the kind of resolute and serious light that only an idealist could possess. Fan Xian concluded that the youth in front of him, as long as he was given a chance to display his abilities, would become a very powerful person in the future. But he also knew that in the kingdom of Qing, if he wanted to make a name for himself, the only way was through the imperial examinations. Even if Fan Xija were to inherit the title of nobility due to his family connections, it would be impossible for him to be given an actual position. No wonder Teng Zijing said that Lady Lu hated her son. In this era, merchants were still not valued. The Ministry of Revenue was one thing, the imperial merchant was another, but the merchants of the common people were another. The game ended quickly, and Count Sinan left his seat expressionlessly. This kind of joyous family gathering was not in his nature, but for some reason, today was different from usual. However, as he left, he glanced at Fan Xian. Fan Xian understood something from the look in his father's eyes. It seemed that he was not happy that he had thrown off the guards his father had sent to protect him during the day. Fan Xian smiled and did not respond. After all, he did not like to be followed. Since that was the case, he might as well take action to clarify this point. Lady Lu looked at her son, and her eyes revealed a trace of affection and helplessness. But this emotion was fleeting. She got up and politely bade farewell to Fan Xian and Fan Ruoruo, then left with her husband. All the servants in Count Sinan's manor knew that the master liked to drink a cup of fruit juice every night before going to bed. This was made by Lady Lu herself to help him sleep, as he toiled away at the Ministry of Revenue. Fan Xian frowned. He had wanted to talk to his father about something, but it seemed that he would have to postpone it. He turned his head and saw Fan Xija still bent over the table, recording the numbers. He asked curiously, "Aren't you going to collect the money? What are you recording?" Ruoruo had been playing mahjong for a while and was tired. She gently stretched her wrists and smiled. He gets guests during the new year. That's when father allows him to play for a while. But every time he wins, he doesn't allow him to keep the copper he wins. He says that a man should not be greedy for such petty gains. Xija doesn't dare go against his father's wishes, but he always records how much he wins. He says that he'll slowly settle accounts with us in the future. Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat. The word settle accounts had a different meaning. He steadied his mind and smiled. "Xija, I see that you're good at calculating. What are you going to do when you grow up?" Fan Xija was young, but when it came to keeping accounts, he was very focused. He didn't answer Fan Xian's question. Ruoruo thought that her brother didn't know her brother's temper, and was afraid that he would be unhappy. She prepared to help explain, but then she saw Fan Xian's face full of smiles. He was looking at the young man keeping accounts with some appreciation. After the accounts were finished, Fan Xija seemed to remember the question Fan Xian had just asked. He scratched his head and frowned. "Of course I'm going to study, become an official, and bring glory to the family." Fan Xian looked at him, amused. "Is that true?" Fan Xija's anger dissipated. He lay on the table and said weakly, "If I don't say it like that, mother will hear me and give me a good beating. There are only the three of us here. Why don't you just say the truth?" Fan Xian teased. These words fell into Fan Xija's ears, and they gave him a different feeling. He had grown up in the eyes of servants. Most children of officials had strict fathers and kind mothers, but Fan Xija had strict parents. Later, his father asked his sister to discipline him, but she was even stricter. So he was no stranger to the feeling of respect for his younger brother, but he had never experienced it as an older brother. Hearing the words, "the truth," Fan Xizha was a little dazed. It seemed that this brother, in front of him, who was 4 years older than him, wasn't all that scary. He wasn't like his mother had described him to be, on the contrary, he felt a sense of closeness. I like to make money. What's so good about merchants chasing profit? Ruoruo frowned. Fan Xian looked at his sister with disapproval. He was a little disappointed. We've exchanged letters for so many years, how could she still have such strange ideas? Ruoruo's heart tightened when he glared at her. She knew she had said something wrong, and she quickly shut her mouth. Fan Xian smiled and looked at Fan Xizha. Whatever it is, just do it well. Making money is the same. I support you. What's the use of your support? Fan Xizha sighed. You have to get father to say this. Do it secretly. Fan Xian was like a devil trying to tempt him. Fan Xizha's spirits rose, and then he thought of something. He said passionately, Brother, give me the manuscript for that book. I have a way to sell it for a high price. He didn't seem forced to call him brother. Fan Xian was surprised. Isn't it a bit slow to make money? Are you worried about money? Fan Xizha looked at him with disdain. I'm just trying. Realizing that the kid dared to look down on him, Fan Xian became angry. If you want to get the goods, you'll have to show me the proposal first. Chapter 60. What's a proposal? Fan Xizha looked at his sister for help. Fan Ruoruo blinked and explained, it's what you're going to do. It's very simple. Fan Xizha nodded. Ever since he was a child, he had set a grand goal in his heart. That was why he was able to work hard on these things. Fan Xizha's dream was to become the second richest family in the world, the Yi family. But at the time, he didn't know that his brother, who encouraged him, had anything to do with the Yi family. A nanny took Fan Xizha to wash up. Only the brother and sister were left in the reception hall. Fan Xian walked out in silence, and Ruoruo followed quietly. The brother and sister tacitly walked along the winding corridor. Just as they were about to reach Ruoruo's boudoir, they stopped at the edge of the shallow pool. Ruoruo was the first to speak. I know there shouldn't be a hierarchy, but I feel that if she really wants to walk that path, it will be very difficult. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. A society with people has its own hierarchy. I've told you this before. There's no need to change anything. But the problem is, we can admit that this kind of thing exists, but there's no need to change our own hearts because of its existence. Fan Ruoruo opened her eyes wide and looked at her brother curiously. What's your heart? It's not the Tao that those swindlers talk about. Fan Xian patted his chest. It's just a simple literal meaning. Your heart is, what do you want? He continued, everyone only has one life. How should we spend this one life? When we look back on the past, we won't regret the wasted years, and we won't be ashamed of our mediocrity. Before I die, I can proudly say, I've done everything I wanted to do. Even if I didn't succeed, I've tried. Fan Ruoruo stared at Fan Xian's face with a look of admiration. I didn't say that, Fan Xian explained awkwardly. Someone called Ostrovsky said it. That's a strange name, it's like someone from the other side of the sea. Not bad, but I changed the last part. After all, I'm not a noble person. My vision is only focused on the 3 years ahead and the 3 miles ahead. So, if Zhe-er likes it, then let him work hard. That way, he won't regret it in the future. That's how he acts according to his heart, Fan Ruoruo said thoughtfully. Fan Xian continued his words and said, people have to survive. If they can find a way to support themselves, and this method is where their interests lie, this is a relatively ideal state of survival. Understood. Fan Ruoruo smiled like a blooming flower. Fan Xian smiled. Perhaps you haven't noticed the look on Xia's face when he's calculating. That look reminds me of a saying, serious people are the most beautiful. Fan Ruoruo giggled, thinking that her brother's appearance could be called beautiful. Fan Xian sternly lectured, don't laugh. In this aspect, you really can't compare to him. At least he clearly knows what he wants in this life, but what about you? Even though the people of the capital call you a talented girl, what do you really want to do? The path of poetry is not a small path. If you really want to put your heart into it, you need to be serious and diligent. Don't just treat it as a pastime. Fan Ruoruo lowered her head and accepted the lecture. She felt warmth in the depths of her heart. She thought that in the past, these questions and answers between teacher and student had finally become a reality. How happy was that? Moonlight shone down from above, and when it passed through the shallow pond, it shone on the corners of the corridor. Fan Xian's face happened to be shrouded in the light, and his already beautiful face became even more delicate. Brother is the most beautiful, Fan Ruoruo looked at him and said in a low voice. Fan Xian didn't hear what she said. Thinking about the scene in the flower hall, he was a little lost in thought. He said to himself, I hope this house can be quieter. I hope Lady Lu is smart enough not to disappoint me. Just as the two of them were about to part, Fan Xian suddenly thought of the white-clothed girl he had met in the temple of Qing at dusk. Full of anticipation, he described her appearance, thinking that the girl was obviously the daughter of a very wealthy family in the capital. His sister often visited the back gardens of the manors of the nobility in the capital, so he should know something about her. But after hearing her brother's description, Fan Ruoruo had no clue. She giggled and asked, where did you meet the fairy? Even your soul was taken away. In her mind, her brother had always been a teacher who was far more mature than his age. This was the first time she had seen him with a disappointed expression on his face, and she couldn't help but be curious about the white-clothed girl. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. If even you don't know her, then it looks like I really won't be able to find her. Although he said this, his heart was firm. He knew that one day, he would meet that girl again, eating a chicken drumstick. He suddenly thought of something, and his heart trembled. A stick of candied hawthorn had led him to the temple of Qing, where he had always wanted to go, and then he had seen that girl. These coincidences made him believe in the word fate. His heart was filled with great anticipation, and he said excitedly, do you think it's possible that she is the young lady of the Lin family? Fan Ruoruo frowned. I've never seen the young lady of the Lin family. After all, her identity is a bit. She looked at her brother and said carefully, a bit inconvenient, so very few people know what she looks like. But occasionally, some news comes from the young lady of the Yi family. It's said that the two of them are bosom buddies, and very close. The young lady of the Yi family? Hearing the word Yi now, Fan Xian instinctively felt nervous. The daughter of Yi Zhong, the commander of the capital's garrison, Yi Ling, Fan Ruoruo asked curiously. What's wrong? Fan Xian smiled, thinking of the first day he had entered the capital, when he had seen the girl on the horse. If he could find her, he wasn't afraid of losing any clues. But Fan Ruoruo thought for a moment, then said, but I'm guessing that the girl you met today is definitely not the young lady of the Lin family, so even if I ask Yi Ling, it won't be of any use. Why are you so sure? Fan Xian had always hoped that the plot of a romance novel would come true for him. Hearing this now, he couldn't help but be surprised. Chapter 61. Moonlight shone on the porch. Fan Ruoruo said with pity, my future sister-in-law is said to be suffering from tuberculosis. She often coughs up blood, so she has been forbidden to eat meat. The girl you speak of is eating chicken legs. She thought about the scene her brother had described earlier and couldn't help but laugh. Of course it can't be Miss Lin. Furthermore, it's said that Miss Lin's appearance is only delicate and pretty. She's definitely not as beautiful as you described. Fan Xian thought about it and sighed. He put the matter aside, but he wouldn't give up on the idea of finding the girl. Another image appeared in his mind, and he couldn't help but frown. Tuberculosis? He knew that in this world, tuberculosis was equivalent to an incurable disease. Although he had studied with Fei Jia for a year and had never stopped cultivating in all aspects, since the other party was the daughter of the eldest princess, there would definitely be an imperial physician to treat it. If even the imperial physicians could not cure it, what could he do? Fei Jia's absence was a big problem. The next day, when Fan Xian woke up, he found that his father, sister, and Lady Lu were not there. He ate some porridge in side dishes, then prepared to leave. He planned to go to the temple of Qing to try his luck and see if he could meet the girl again. Just as he was about to leave, Fan Xija ran over and pulled on his sleeve. He pulled him into the study and very seriously handed him a few pieces of paper. Fan Xian looked at him curiously and saw that his brother's eyes were bloodshot. It seemed that he had stayed up all night. "You didn't sleep?" he asked. "If second aunt saw you, wouldn't she scold you again?" Fan Xija laughed. "I learned from you. I kept it a secret." Fan Xian smiled and rubbed the pieces of paper with his fingers. He rested his chin on his hand and looked at them. Written on them were the plans that Fan Xija had made the night before. Although Fan Xian had not been a successful businessman in his previous life, he had seen pigs run. The business atmosphere of his previous life and the kingdom of Qing today could not be mentioned in the same breath. Add to that the special profession he had once held, and he was confident in this. His brows gradually furrowed. "That's a good idea, but I'm not familiar with the capital, so the location of the bookstore is up to you. But there's a problem. Although we're the only one who has the manuscript, how can you guarantee that other booksellers won't steal it after you've printed it?" Fan Xija said with a face full of fanaticism, "The family is very idle now, and those servants have nothing to do. We can let them wander the streets, and if they see a pirated shop, they can smash it." Fan Xian was dumbfounded. "Do you only know how to smash and rob?" It did not meet his expectations at all. He shook his head with a bitter smile. "Don't think that the booksellers are inconspicuous. In fact, the profits they make are not small. Who knows what kind of background they have? What are you afraid of? This manuscript originally belonged to our family. How can he be justified in stealing it?" Fan Xija shouted. Fan Xian reminded him, "There are no provisions in the Qing kingdom's laws that protect manuscripts from being printed. Besides, this book didn't pass the 8th Bureau's inspection. If you go to court, I'm afraid you'll have to pay for it first." Fan Xija chuckled and said, "I'm not afraid of that. If we really want to open a bookstore, we can just have our father write a letter. The 8th Bureau won't refuse." Fan Xian thought about it and agreed. His seemingly ordinary father had a much deeper relationship with the Overwatch Council than most people knew. He changed his mind and said, "But even if you get rid of your identity as a banned book, you can't just rely on smashing and robbing to destroy your competitors. As the saying goes, you can't hit someone in the face. You chased away middle-aged women on the streets and alleys of the capital and closed down other people's shops. That's a way of shedding all pretense of cordiality. For the sake of money, it's not worth it for both sides to fight each other. What are you afraid of?" Fan Xija rolled his eyes. It seemed that his older brother was a bit too soft-hearted. "If you don't think it's worth it, you can think of a way to make a rule. In the future, we'll follow the rule. If other booksellers dare to steal it again, we'll just have the authorities deal with it." Fan Xian laughed heartily. "Rules? Do you think the laws of the court will be so trifling? Just because the Fan family wants to publish a book, they'll change the law?" Fan Xija shook his head. How can we change the law? Of course, we have to take the lower path. Changing the rules of the Jingdo garrison is very simple. That fierce woman in Yizhong's family has a good relationship with Princess Rojia. We just have to ask my sister to let Prince Jing's manor and the Yi manor know. Fan Xian's interest was piqued. The capital's garrison regulations can regulate the sale of books? Fan Xija was surprised. After thinking for a moment, he said, there seems to be a clause in there that governs refugees and traveling merchants. It'll be a good time to make use of it. Fan Xian was full of admiration. He thought that this young man in front of him had the potential to become an unscrupulous businessman. He could even think of such a ruthless move as collusion between the government and merchants and the city guards. But he knew that there was always a gap between ideals and reality. He asked, have you calculated the profits? 10 chapters per volume, 8 taels of silver per volume. There are 68 chapters in total. There are 640,000 people in the capital. 1 volume per 1,000 people means that we can sell more than 600 copies. If we calculate it carefully, we can sell them for 35,840 taels of silver. Fan Xija explained with great interest. He had already calculated all of these costs. The rent on Luodong Road is more expensive. Plus the editing costs, we can leave the printing to the Hall of Scrolls. That way, we won't have to worry about it. The Hall of 10,000 Scrolls? Fan Xian asked curiously. The most famous private printing workshop in the capital. Fan Xija laughed sinisterly. They have a big business, but they don't have any reliable people behind them. If they dare to steal our manuscripts, we can just copy them and turn them upside down. I'm afraid they'll make even more money. Fan Xian was so depressed that he wanted to vomit blood. If we calculate it carefully, we can make at least a few thousand taels of silver in the year. If we can really make other booksellers stop, the number will increase. Fan Xian sighed. You're too optimistic. If you want to be a successful businessman, you must first prepare for a rainy day. Let's talk about the number you estimated. Although the people of the capital are wealthy, each set costs more than 50 taels of silver. How many people can afford it? Fan Xija was shocked. He looked at Fan Xian as if he were looking at a monster. Don't you know the market price of your book? Fan Xian's eyes widened. In his previous life, Dream of the Red Chamber had become popular during the reign of the Qianlong Emperor. He had heard rumors that it was sold for hundreds of taels of silver. But that was only a handwritten copy, and not many copies had been circulated. If you were going to publish it in a big way, could it be sold for so much? Fan Xija sighed. A few days ago, I heard that the daughter of the capital's magistrate read your book. She couldn't eat or drink, and was in a daze. The magistrate's wife burned the manuscript. She cried out in pain, "Why did you burn my precious treasure?" She fell ill for a long time. Brother, the capital is not like other places. There are as many officials as there are carps swimming around. How many young ladies are there who have nothing to do? Selling hundreds or thousands of copies is not a problem. Fan Xian was dumbfounded. He wondered if he should bring some snacks to the poor magistrate's daughter. Chapter 62. Then he heard Fan Xija say proudly, "This is just a small amount of money. After I've earned this much, I'll write another 70 or 80 chapters. I can't sell them all, I'll have to edit them carefully and make a rare edition. Then I'll auction them all off in private. Whoever wants to see the end first, whoever wants to see whether or not Miss Duo is married to Second Master Bao, will have to pay up first." Fan Xian twisted his ear and scolded him, "What does Miss Duo have to do with Second Master Bao? You've never even read a book, and you want to sell it." Fan Xija felt wronged. "The one you bought on the street yesterday, I asked my sister to read it when I got home, but, after reading a few dozen words, I felt it was boring, so I fell asleep. This young master of Fan Manor, who only cared about money, really didn't understand why the women in the capital were crazy about this tasteless book. Fine, I won't argue with you about this, Fan Xian said helplessly. But these things are complicated, and you're just a little kid who has to go to school. You don't have time for these things. Let's wait a few years. A few years? The safflower would be cold by then, Fan Xia shrieked. What else can we do? You're a son of Fan Manor, after all. If you really go into business, how can you hide it from Lady Lu and father? Be careful, or they'll tear your skin off. Fan Xia said painfully, yes, so I've decided to borrow a shopkeeper from Qingyu Hall, and I'll have to hide behind the scenes. Fan Xian was very surprised. Aside from being rude and unreasonable, this young man in front of him was also very talented in business. He had actually thought of becoming a professional manager. In his excitement, Fan Xian had inadvertently left out the words, Qingyu Hall. Seeing that the boy had made up his mind, he sighed and took out the banknotes he had accumulated over the years, plus the money his sister had given him, and handed them over. He told him to take it slow, and to first discuss things with the servants in the manor. It wasn't a good idea to feed those people without using them. Fan Xia beamed and counted the money. He found that this brother of his had a lot of money, and with the money he had saved up, he should have enough for his first startup capital. Fan Xian didn't say anything else. He only carefully reminded him, if you want to use the connections of the upper class to suppress the good people of the lower class, other than relying on your father's name, you also have to promise other people some benefits. What are you talking about, big brother? Fan Xia said fiercely, of course we have to bribe them. If you become a high-ranking official in the future, there will be a day when they will spit it back out. Fan Xian almost fainted. He quickly pushed the door open and left. In the past, he had always felt that banknotes had a peculiar fragrance. Today, he realized that the stench of money really was overwhelming. It was noon, and the sun was blazing fiercely. The trees on both sides of the road drooped lifelessly, unable to provide any comfort or shelter to the pitiful pedestrians. Fan Xian picked up a bowl of sour plum soup by the side of the road and took small sips. He knew that drinking too quickly wouldn't quench his thirst, and his stomach wouldn't be able to take it. He listened to the sounds of cicadas, in the trees next to him and was very puzzled. What month was it? Spring hadn't even passed yet, so why was summer already here? In the distance, the temple of Qing looked particularly solemn under the sun. It had dried up some of its original elegance, and its black, round eaves reflected the sunlight. The scene was very sacred. Today, the temple of Qing was more lively than yesterday. From time to time, people would go in to pray. Fan Xian was a little curious. Why had it been so quiet when he had gone yesterday? Of course, he didn't know that when the nobleman had stolen half a day's rest, both sides of the road had already been guarded. The reason he had been able to walk to the door and exchange blows with the master was all because of someone's secret indulgence. Wu Zhu had indeed indulged him, indulging him in drinking and fooling around. Even when he wanted to go to the temple, Wu Zhu would knock out so many guards for such a small matter. Fan Xian didn't know how much trouble he had gotten himself into yesterday. He was still sitting on the bench, drinking sour plum soup, and waiting for the girl with his legs crossed. In a room very close to the temple of Qing, the sunlight couldn't penetrate the room, so it was a little dark and cool. Gong Jian sat coldly on a chair, adjusting his internal energy so that he could enter into peak condition. Last night he had been on duty, but this morning he hadn't returned home. Instead, he had come to the temple of Qing. Because no matter how he thought about it, he felt that there was something strange about the appearance of that young man yesterday. All of his subordinates had been knocked out by a grandmaster at the same time. What was the connection between that and that young man entering the temple of Qing? For some reason, Gong Dian felt that the young man would definitely come here again today. Perhaps that mysterious master would also come here. This was the intuition of a master. Although it wasn't necessarily accurate, it was worth a gamble. But that damned eunuch Hong didn't believe his judgment at all. He just kept investigating among the guards, so Fan Xian had to come alone. Gong Dian sat quietly in the room. His gaze passed through the narrow crack in the window, coldly looking at the entrance of the Temple of Qing. Outside, Fan Xian finally couldn't stand the scorching sun anymore. He drank the soup in one gulp, undid the 2 buttons on his shirt, and walked toward the Temple of Qing with his tongue out. Fan Xian's footsteps drew closer and closer to the Temple of Qing. Gong Dian seemed to hear something and frowned slightly. Under the sky full of sunlight, Fan Xian's feet felt hot when they landed on the stone floor. He seemed to hate this feeling and pulled his feet back. Then, he fastened the buttons on his chest and turned around with a smile. He returned to the stall selling sour plum soup and asked for another bowl. He slowly drank it, then walked away from the Temple of Qing with leisurely steps. It wasn't until he got into the waiting carriage at the end of the street that he exhaled and shouted, "Return to the manor quickly." Teng Zijing looked at him curiously and found that the young master's face was expressionless. Sitting in the carriage, Fan Xian turned his head and lifted the rear curtain to look in the direction of the Temple of Qing. He frowned, not knowing why Wu Zhu had told him to leave, and even less knowing who was waiting for him there. Gong Dian's face was cold as he looked in front of him. When he heard the footsteps heading back, his eyes lit up and he prepared to stand up. Unexpectedly, he felt a gust of cold wind blowing from behind him and his neck felt cold. It was late spring, and the weather was hot, but Gong Dian broke out in a cold sweat. His hands rested steadily on his knees. His fingernails were well manicured, and the simple but incomparably sharp knife rested 3 inches in front of his hands. But he didn't dare to draw it. He could feel that the person behind him was stronger and faster than him. Chapter 63. Gong Dian was recognized as one of the strongest fighters in the capital. He had experienced countless life and death situations in his life, but he had never imagined that he would meet such a powerful figure in the heavily guarded capital, next to the Temple of Qing. The aura of the person behind him was not very strong, but the feeling of being one with the environment was something that Gong Dian had only seen from his uncle. He and the commander of the capital's garrison were brothers, and his uncle was Yi Luyun, one of the 4 grandmasters in the world. From what he knew, he could not imagine that a grandmaster would disregard his identity and appear behind him like an assassin. The room was silent for a long time. The little finger on Gong Dian's left hand trembled slightly. He knew that he could no longer maintain this passive balance, and a cold light flashed in his eyes. Without any warning, the real qi in his body rushed out, and his whole body turned into a gray dragon. His left foot kicked backwards, and his right hand hooked. Clang! A clear sound rang out, and the blade cut through the air. It turned into a fearless slash, and chopped behind him. With a muffled grunt, the slash hit nothing but air. The mysterious grandmaster from before had long disappeared. Gong Dian's inner strength was vigorous, and after his slash missed, he was unable to restrain his spirit. His chest felt as if it had been struck by lightning, and a hot current rushed up his body. 2 streaks of blood seeped out of his nostrils. Looking at the empty ground, there was no fear in Gong Dian's eyes, only a trace of confusion. The opponent clearly had the ability to easily assassinate him, so why did he leave in the end? In an instant, he thought of the youth from the day before, which was very similar to his own. He guessed that the grandmaster who had just appeared and disappeared might have some connection to his own school, and that was why he had been merciful. After resting for a while, he walked out of the small room with a somewhat dispirited expression, ready to return to the manor. Why did Wu Zhu not kill him? It was obvious that it was not because of Yi Liuyun's incense. After all, Wu Zhu was a monster who even dared to kill Yi Luyun. The reason was actually very simple. Yesterday, Gong Dian had made Fan Xian vomit blood, so today, Wu Zhu wanted to make Gong Dian vomit blood. It was that simple. It was still early when Fan Xijia returned to Fan Manor. Fan Xijia was still in his study, working on his money-making project. Ruoruo had been sent off to someone. In the entire garden, there were only a few servants and maids. Although some of the maids were very pretty, Fan Xian was not in a good mood, and the environment was not right, so he had no interest in teasing them. He drank a cup of tea and frowned. Who was it that was in the temple of Qing today? Why was the other party guarding him there? Could it be that it was a family member left behind by the lady in white, waiting for him? Thinking of this possibility, Fan Xian's heart warmed. But, thinking of Wu Zhu's message, his heart immediately cooled. If it was as he guessed, Uncle Wu Zhu would certainly not care. He was a wooden person and was not very interested in the matters of love. Fan Xian changed into a lighter set of clothes, loosened his belt, and entered his father's study. To his surprise, he found Count Sinan there. There's not much to do in the ministry today. Fan Jing had his son sit down. You've been in the capital for a few days now. Don't be fooling around outside all day. I already know about what happened in the restaurant yesterday. In the future, you should avoid these kinds of conflicts as much as possible. Don't be like that good-for-nothing brother of yours. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. He didn't want to explain any further. Suddenly, he thought of something and asked, "Father, when can I go see Miss Lin?" Fan Jing seemed surprised that the young man would make such a suggestion. "When you're married," he said with a smile, "you'll see her every day." "Are you in a rush?" Fan Xian pursed his lips into a smile. "After marriage is after marriage. I don't want to go to the bridal chamber without knowing what my wife looks like." He thought for a moment, then smiled. "I see my sister, that Yi Linger, and Princess Wuxia are often out. Is there anything wrong with keeping a distance between a man and a woman? A young man and a young woman seeing each other isn't too much." Fan Jing smiled. "But you must know that Miss Lin's identity is rather special. Although her surname is Lin, she has little to do with the Prime Minister's manor. She grew up in the palace. For the sake of the royal family, and for the sake of the eldest princess, His Majesty took her in as his adopted daughter. She was given the title of princess, but this princess is different from Wuxia." Fan Jing's voice was a little suppressed. Although few people know that she is the daughter of the eldest princess, and that she is the daughter of Master Lin, no one dares to say it, and no one dares to admit it. She lives in the palace for many years, and very few people see her. It was only at the beginning of the year that she moved out because of that incident, and because of her poor health. Fan Xian sighed. "I heard that she was in poor health, so I wanted to see her. Perhaps I could be of some help." Fan Jing frowned. "You and Fei Jia have only been together for a year and a half. Do you dare to say that you are better than the imperial physicians? Young people should be modest and cautious." Fan Xian agreed, but he still didn't give up. "But you have to at least let me know what she looks like, right? You married her not for her, but for what she stands for." Fan Jing looked at him coldly. "You must abandon all unrealistic ideas, and be as hard as a rock to crush any stale feelings of warmth." Fan Xian furrowed his brows with some disgust and said, "I feel that your words are also very corny." Fan Jing was slightly angry. "How can you say that?" Fan Xian smiled, and replied respectfully, "I've said it before. I am not a person who is easy to control. Don't you want to take back everything that belongs to you?" Fan Jing seemed to have thought of something, and calmed down. Fan Xian was surprised, and then very seriously said, "Actually, when I was in Danzhou, I learned many things. I believe that I have the ability to achieve things in this world that correspond to my abilities. If I can take back my mother's business, of course I won't object, but this must be based on my own will. If I want to, I will do it. If I don't want to, I won't. It's that simple. Chapter 64. Fan Jian sighed. He knew that the young man in front of him was just like his mother. Neither could be persuaded. His eyes softened, and he said softly, "This marriage between the two families is not the true driving force behind it, nor is it the Prime Minister's manner. Because there are many things involved, the matter is a bit complicated. Since you want to see the girl, then find a way to do it yourself." "I can't do it myself." Fan Xian bowed. "As long as father agrees, I will find a way to see her." He thought of what he had heard earlier, and felt a little puzzled. What if the Prime Minister refuses to agree to the marriage? Count Sinan laughed coldly. "As I said, there is a great power behind this, and he has no choice but to agree. Don't forget, the young lady of the Lin family has not returned to the Lin family. She is still His Majesty's adopted daughter, a princess of the palace." In April and May weather, Fan Xian felt as if someone had poured a bucket of ice water over him from head to toe. It was cold. It was only now that he realized that his marriage was not as simple as it seemed because it involved the emperor's decision on who would be in charge of the large estate. The real decision-maker behind the scenes was actually some powerful figure hidden in the depths of the palace. But he didn't know if it was the Empress Dowager or the Emperor. "Why does the Prime Minister oppose it?" he asked, frowning. Count Sinan took a sip of tea and frowned. It seemed that the tea was a little bitter. He stuck the tip of his tongue between his teeth and said indistinctly, "Didn't I say it last time?" Fan Xian smiled and pointed out his father's faulty wording. "Last time, you said that the Prime Minister was afraid that His Majesty would suspect that there was something hidden behind his marriage with the Fan family. But in fact, since the marriage was approved by the palace, what does he have to fear?" Fan Jian was speechless for a moment. It took him a while to recover. He smiled and put his teacup on the table. "Fine, I'll tell you the truth. It's the eldest princess who doesn't want her daughter to marry you." Fan Xian was startled. What was this? After all this fuss, the other party's parents didn't want to marry her. What was he doing? It would be better for him to wash his hands clean and go beg the noble family's young lady in white. That was what he thought, but he knew he could not say it out loud. His father was still able to persuade some important person in the palace to force the marriage even though the eldest princess and the Prime Minister were against it. One could imagine how much hidden power the Fan family had used in the process. "Why isn't the eldest princess willing?" he asked curiously, thinking to himself, that Miss Lin's background is not much different from mine. Confucius and a little stud, we're both illegitimate children. What's the point of putting on airs? This is an anomaly. His Majesty loves that princess very much, even more than the princess. Once, when I was drunk, I unintentionally mentioned that if the princess were to get married, the eldest princess should hand over her power to the princess's future husband, lest the royal bloodline would suffer in the future. Count Sinan gently stroked his 4-inch beard, seemingly in a good mood. Fan Xian spread his hands and sighed. So that's how it is. It seems that the eldest princess is also someone who loves power. Back then, I don't know why she didn't marry the Prime Minister and raise children and grandchildren. Wouldn't that have been much happier? Count Sinan laughed coldly. In the end, it's love that hurts. If the princess had married Lin Ruofu, he would have been noble, but he would not have been able to display his knowledge. How could he have become the head of all the officials like he is now, with his limitless glory? Fan Xian frowned. Only now did he remember that the emperor's son-in-law could not enter the court as an official. He only had a title in name. If you were to marry that Miss Lin, even though she is only a princess in the palace and not in the imperial register, I'm afraid there would be some problems with your career." Count Sinan saw him frown and thought that this was what he was worried about, so he simply said it out loud. Fan Xian stood up and smiled. "We'll talk about it later." "That's true. After the imperial examinations next year, you'll have to start studying." Fan Xian wondered if he really would have to participate in the imperial examinations and compete with those Fan Jeans. He smiled wryly and did not reply. Then Count Sinan told him that the next day, Prince Jing's monthly poetry conference would be held again, and that Fan Xian should prepare. When Fan Xian heard this, it was not as frightening as telling him to write 8 essays. But when he thought of the possibility of being forced to fabricate a few salt smugglers, Old Xian, Old Su, Old Li, and Old Du, Fan Xian felt a headache coming on. Fan Xian looked at him and smiled. "I know you have a talent for poetry. In some situations, you don't need to hide your talent too much. Even though there are people in the palace who will help with this marriage, if you can gain some reputation in the capital's literary circles, the eldest princess might be more willing to marry off her daughter." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He knew that the old man in front of him had secretly read the letters he had written to his sister. Naturally, he could not hide the fact that he had written "Dream of the Red Chamber" from him. But seeing that his father had endured until now, he couldn't help but admire his shrewd and ruthless character. There were no Sundays in this era. Even if you worked, there was no god who would take a knife to chop you. Similarly, there were no Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, or even Fridays in this era. In short, there was no clear distinction between working days and rest days. Shops were open every day, and government affairs were handled every day. It was said that even the emperor could not stop for a single day to pass through memorials. But for the children of the wealthy families that could be found everywhere in the capital, the only thing they could do every day was play. After the war 16 years ago, the northern Wei kingdom was divided and weak. The western barbarians fled far away, leaving only 1,000 wild horses grazing in the Yin Mountains. With one command from the emperor, the great prince led 100,000 soldiers to the western frontier. This was also a form of play. In the kingdom of Qing, martial arts flourished. But after the emperor grew tired of fighting, he suddenly became fond of poetry. Whatever the emperor liked, the emperor followed suit. Most of the children of the other wealthy families did not have anything to do, nor did they have the right to lead troops for play. Fortunately, they all had to prepare for the imperial examinations, so they could play with elegance. They played to a different level from the common people. They had to read books, understand books, read poems, and write poems. So now, the most popular thing in the capital was not the duels between martial arts masters, but the so-called poetry conferences. Chapter 65. Both the Crown Prince's and the Crown Prince's poetry gatherings were the busiest social occasions in the capital. They were held once a month, rain or shine. Who knew how many scholars from poor families and poets from poor families tried their best to get involved, hoping to make a name for themselves with a poem or phrase, and find a way to rise in status. The Crown Prince was fond of literature, and this was something everyone knew. Although Crown Prince Jing was the emperor's younger brother, he had always aspired to be a wealthy and idle prince, so he did not have much power. Comparing the two, those with clear goals were naturally more willing to go to the Crown Prince's side. But if they could get a compliment from Crown Prince Jing, it was also a good way to make a name for themselves. So every time the poetry gatherings were held, the Crown Prince's manor, not far from Shishing Gate, would always welcome many guests. Some of these guests came in palanquins, some in carriages, and some on foot. But the old housekeeper at the gate treated them all the same. After checking their name cards, he respectfully invited them in. Fan Xian sat in the palanquin, his face very ugly, alternating between green and white. From time to time, he covered his mouth to suppress the urge to vomit. Because he had come to attend the poetry gatherings, which was a scholarly event, sitting in a palanquin with green curtains would have been more appropriate. He had requested to sit in a palanquin with his sister. But having lived by the Danzhou coast for so long, he did not feel dizzy from the swaying of the boat, but the palanquin did. As he struggled, he pulled open the side curtain of the palanquin and asked Teng Zijing weakly, "How far is it?" Teng Zijing held back his laughter and replied, "Just past the intersection." Fan Xian grunted and sat back down. His fingers opened like orchids, and he put his thumb and ring finger together, allowing the Zhenqi to slowly flow out and cleanse his internal organs. The nausea was somewhat gone, but it could not cure the palanquin dizziness. At that moment, there were many questions lingering in his mind, and his body was not feeling well, so he furrowed his brows. These days living in the manor, he felt that his father was very different from what he had imagined, and there were many things that he could not explain. For example, why did he care so much about his illegitimate son? Was it really because of his mother that he loved him as well? He turned his head to look out of the sedan chair. Through the thin green cloth, he saw the figure sitting on the horse. He knew that although Teng Zijing was currently leaning towards him, he was still his father's man, and he could not completely trust him. He sighed and thought to himself that he had to find some trustworthy subordinates. Uncle Wu Zhu was like a ghost and was not someone he could casually order around. Fan Xian really wanted to know what his mother had done in Jingdou, how she had met his father, and how she had left this world. This wasn't just out of pure curiosity and admiration. He believed that only by knowing his history would he be able to better grasp his present and future. In the royal prince's estate, a few scholars were bowing to a young man in front of a garden gate. They had never expected that Crown Prince Jing's heir would personally welcome them at the gate for today's poetry meet. Two small green curtain sedans slowly swayed over. Crown Prince Jing somewhat impatiently cupped his hands at those fellows who were bowing to him, and then went forward to greet them. Only now did the scholars realize that they had misunderstood, but they did not dare to show any expression on their faces. They continued to smile proudly and elegantly cupped their hands in salute. Led by the housekeeper, they went to the back garden. The servants at the gate of the manor were curious as well. What kind of distinguished guest could make the crown prince personally come out to welcome them? When they saw the girl in the yellow dress step down from the first sedan chair, they realized that it was the young lady of Fan Manor. Not to mention the relationship between King Jing's manor and Fan Manor, considering the personal relationship between Princess Wuxia and Miss Fan, it was inconvenient for a girl to show her face in public, so it was only right for her to be welcomed outside the garden. Sister Ruoruo. Crown Prince Jing's surname was Li, and his name was Hongcheng. In the capital, he had always been inseparable from places like brothels. But in front of Miss Fan, the crown prince kept his head down and appeared very polite. Fan Ruoruo bowed slightly and greeted the crown prince. She then smiled and said, "What topic did Wuxia set today?" The crown prince smiled and replied, but his eyes occasionally glanced at the sedan chair behind him. It had been half a day, so why hadn't that man come down yet? A servant had already come forward and very respectfully lifted the curtain of the sedan chair. Unexpectedly, the sedan chair was empty. For a moment, everyone in the manor was shocked. What was going on? Fan Ruoruo covered her mouth and laughed. She explained, "Brother is in the back." As they spoke, they saw a young man of 16 or 17 rushing over from not far away, panting. He was followed by an attendant. This young man was wearing a light maroon unlined shirt, and his collar buttons were not fastened properly, which inevitably made him look a little frivolous. However, when paired with his cute, friendly, and clean face, others would feel that this person should be dressed in such a relaxed manner. Sorry. Fan Xian cupped his hands and bowed to the crown prince. He said awkwardly, "I was dizzy in the sedan chair, so I walked all the way here." The weather was a bit hot, so I drank a bowl of sour berries outside the manor before coming here. I'm late, late. You're not late, you're not late. As soon as Li Hongqing saw the young man he had met once before, he was overjoyed. He laughed and said, "It is good that Brother Fan is here." Fan Xian heard the way he addressed him, and noticed that there was an extra "fan" in it. For a moment, he didn't know what attitude the Crown Prince was trying to express. He paused, and a smile appeared on his face. The sour berries outside the manor are better than anywhere else, so of course I came to see. The Crown Prince, Li Hongqing, smiled slightly. Seeing the conversation drift off into the distance, he found it even more interesting. He led the way, and the two of them entered the garden. When Fan Xian was in Danzhou, he knew that his sister was a good poet. Although in his opinion, these poems were often just sentimental and couldn't escape certain conventions. There were still good poems in this era, but it was clear that the young scholars who often attended the poetry gatherings didn't have much attainment, so Fan Ruoruo still had a small reputation as a poet. So he was very curious about how his sister would behave on such an occasion, and what Princess Ruoxia, who had caused the outflow of Dream of the Red Chamber and sold it to the bootleg bookseller, would look like. But as he followed Li Hongqing into the back garden, with its winding corridors and flowing water, he realized that in this seemingly open country, men and women still sat separately. The women sat in a pavilion across the lake, with layers of white muslin hanging in front of them, dancing in the wind. Fan Xian followed the Crown Prince to the other side of the lake, a little disappointed. Looking at the muslin in the distance, he couldn't help but think of Zhou Xingxing, whom he had loved the most in his previous life. He sighed to himself, "It really feels like first love." Chapter 66. In the back garden of Prince Jing's manor. Remembering that the two families were familiar with each other, the Crown Prince asked Fan Xian to make himself at home and went to greet the other guests. After all, there were a few eye-catching people here today. Fan Xian did not know of the undercurrents beneath the calm surface. He walked casually, and among the seemingly scattered seats, he found an isolated spot that suited his temperament and sat down. Seeing that there was wine on the table, he very consciously poured a cup and took a sip. Fan Xian sighed in his heart and looked up at the sky. It was fortunate that the sun was not too hot today. Otherwise, he would not be able to see any beautiful women at this poetry gathering, and he would have to listen to sour poems. With the sun roasting him, he would become a vinegar-dried chicken. The scholars seemed to be sitting casually, but in reality they were all surrounding a small table in the middle of the grass, so not many people noticed him. A few noblemen near him saw that he was unfamiliar, but he had been personally brought in by the Crown Prince. They curiously stepped forward to greet him, ready to ask about his background. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian smiled wholeheartedly and spoke seamlessly. After a long time, they still did not know which family this beautiful young man was from. After chatting for a while, they could not help but feel a little bored, so they all retreated and quietly waited for the poetry gathering to begin. It was said that this day was different from the previous few days. The sun was gentle, the willows were fluttering, and the spring breeze was strong enough to drill into people's collars. Of course, the wind at the end of spring did not have any cold power. It was like an invisible little hand gently moving, very comfortable. It was the perfect time to sleep. Fan Xian was not a dissolute madman, so at first he put on a smile and forced his eyes open, listening to the poetry and watching the wine being poured. But with the spring breeze and the little sun, he felt that the poetry gathering was really boring, so he gradually felt dizzy and wanted to sleep. He could only vaguely hear a few sentences, such as, "In the dream of Lizhou Road, here we go again." If not for the mountain man asking for a high price, he would laugh at himself. And, "The wine cup is thick, a gourd drunk Lu Wang, a gourd of wine pressing down on the tip of a flower." And, "The Dongi people are all wandering, thanks to this man's maturity." Fan Xian pinched the web between his thumb and index finger to wake himself up. Although he did not like reciting poetry, in this kind of situation, he could not reveal the personality of his past life that had not been washed away after 16 years. So he smiled, but looked at the scene somewhat woodenly. As he looked, he saw a few people he was not familiar with. These people were sitting in the most comfortable seats by the lake. They were Guo Baoquan, He Zhongwei, and the others who had a conflict at the restaurant the day before yesterday. Fan Xian frowned slightly. Crown Prince Jing clearly knew about the dispute between Fan Manor and the Guo family that day, so why did he call both sides over today? As if sensing his gaze, Guo Baoquan, who had been showing off his mature and steady demeanor to the beauties across the lake, turned his head. When he saw that it was the Fan family's black boxer, his expression changed. He could no longer maintain his scholarly demeanor, and subconsciously threw the fan in his hand onto the table. There was an Imperial College student explaining the meaning of the scriptures, so not many people noticed Guo Baoquan's son's reaction. The people at Guo Baoquan's table followed his gaze, and immediately found Fan Xian hiding in a remote corner. Their expressions changed, thinking that they were all scholars, and they had not brought any guards with them today. If that Fan Manor boy used another black boxer, who would stand up to him? Fan Xian looked at them with a smile and nodded, greeting them as if they were friends. The people at the table discussed something in low voices, and a slightly gloomy smile gradually appeared on their faces. Guo Baoquan's face, which had always been gloomy, had an additional hint of joy. Only He Zhongwei seemed to have a disapproving expression. It was unknown what the girls on the other side of the lake were doing under the white silk, but the court lady had long since copied the poems that the girls had composed and sent them here for the scholars to evaluate. The Crown Prince laughed heartily. Although women are not inferior to men, literature is not a battle of brute force. Do not be courteous, you cannot lose to those weak women. Everyone agreed in unison, and laughter gradually arose. Someone suggested using something as a topic to compose a poem, and then choosing the 3 best ones to match with the one on the other side of the lake. A scholar at Guo Baoquan's table rolled his eyes, and cupped his hands in salute. I am not talented, how about using the lake as a topic? Excellent, today's blue waves are floating gold. Someone else suggested. Absolutely, look at the lake and the mountains. Someone else suggested. Guo Baoquan rolled his eyes and looked at Fan Xian. I did not expect young Master Fan to come today, he said in a loud voice. Why don't we start with young Master Fan? Fan Xian had come today on his father's orders, to show off in front of the people of the capital. Hearing that he was being asked to compose a poem, he smiled and shook his head. I do not have that ability. Everyone, please. Seeing him concede, Guo Baoquan increasingly felt that he really was an embroidered pillow. He laughed coldly. A few days ago, Brother Fan was talking big in Yishe Tavern, looking down on all the scholars of the world. Today, I see that you are stingy with your advice. It seems that your standards are indeed very high. Hearing him say this, everyone present realized that there had long been animosity between the two sides, and that he was using poetry to pick a fight. Most of the people in the manor were guests of King Jing's manor. Although they did not know who Fan Xian was, they saw that he seemed to be familiar with the Crown Prince, so some people guessed that he might be a descendant of the Fan clan. Few people guessed that he was the son of Count Sinan, Fan Jian. Seeing the people around him talking, Guo Baoquan took a sip of tea and laughed darkly. Brother Fan is the one who recently entered the capital. Everyone should have heard of him. None of the people present were idiots. They immediately knew who Fan Xian was, and when they looked at him again, their gazes were filled with pity, disdain, and many other complicated emotions. Fan Xian's expression did not change. He still wore a faint smile, but he insisted on not composing a poem. Crown Prince Jing looked at the smile on Fan Xian's face and found it increasingly difficult to see through him. A strange look flashed in his eyes, and he tried to smooth things over. Poetry is poetry. Brother Fan has no intention of doing so today. Everyone, please recite. Fan Xian leaned lazily on the table, watching everyone go back and forth, listening to each other's lackluster sentences. He felt very bored. In the eyes of the bystanders, this appearance was somewhat presumptuous. Inevitably, someone mocked, "Miss Fan is famous in the capital for her poetry." Who would have thought that the young master of the Fan family would speak in silence? How unexpected. Guo Baoquan lowered his voice and laughed. After all, he was not raised in the manner. Of course he has to be different. Although he lowered his voice, he deliberately made sure that everyone around him could hear. Although the kingdom of Qing was liberal, the status of an illegitimate child was not something that could be revealed in public. And Fan Xian's status was even more sensitive. Hearing him deliberately say this, for a moment, a strange atmosphere filled the air. Chapter 67. Behind the lake, under a white blanket, was a pavilion. 5 or 6 girls were sitting inside. Some were eating fruit and looking across the lake, covering their mouths as they laughed. Others were frowning, holding brushes in their hands as they pondered something. Judging by their clothing, they were either rich or noble. They were probably the daughters of officials in the capital. One of them wore a light yellow, tight-fitting jacket. Her eyes were unusually bright, like the translucent jade of the Western Sea. It was Yi Linger, the only daughter of the capital garrison, whom Fan Xian had caught a glimpse of from afar outside the capital. Yi Linger's gaze swept across the lake. She turned her head to look at Fan Ruoruo. "Ruoruo, is that shameful child of yours here today?" Hearing this, Fan Ruoruo felt an inexplicable anger rise in her heart. She slammed the brush in her hand onto the table. "Yi Linger," she said lightly, "your mouth is like those knives and spears in your house. It's one thing to have a few sharp edges, but what kind of sauce shop did you come from today?" Hearing this, the girls in the pavilion all fell silent. No one had expected that the beautiful and gentle young lady of the Fan family would speak in such a manner. For some reason, Yi Linger hated the illegitimate son of the Fan family. That was why she had spoken so rudely earlier. Seeing the gentle young lady of the Fan family speak so harshly to her, she snorted. Anger rose in her heart, but she couldn't find the words to retort. Princess Wuxia was grinding ink by Fan Ruoruo's side. Hearing the conversation between the two girls, she giggled and said innocently, "You two are usually very good friends. Why do you look like you've eaten sulfur today?" Princess Wuxia was the youngest of the girls, and her status was the highest. Her temperament was also the most gentle, so when she spoke, the two girls in the atmosphere were unable to make a move. Yi Linger snorted. "Who knows what young Lady Fan is like today?" Fan Ruoruo smiled slightly, suppressing her anger. Her long eyelashes fluttered. Although she was the daughter of an official, and Fan Ruoruo had always been known as a talented woman, she was still a young girl of 16. Who could hold back? She replied gently, "My words concern my elder brother. I dare not be rude." Yi Linger laughed coldly. "How am I rude? Could it be that the person who came with you today has already acknowledged his ancestry and entered the Fan clan's genealogy?" Fan Ruoruo was exceptionally intelligent. She knew why Yi Ling was venting her anger on her brother. She smiled coldly and didn't answer. She walked out of the pavilion, and for some reason, Yi Ling followed. Princess Wuxia sighed quietly but didn't know what to do. The women in the pavilion also didn't know who Yi Linger was talking about. They also didn't know why the two of them were suddenly angry. They couldn't help but be confused. Outside the pavilion, the servant girls did not follow them. Fan Ruoruo was much more direct with her words. Her face darkened as she said, "You are friends with Miss Lin, that is your business. She is not willing to marry my brother, that is her business. But if you speak rudely to my brother again, don't blame me for not caring about our past friendship." Yi Ling'er wrinkled her nose beautifully and complained. "Yesterday, when you came to my manor, I told you that Chener doesn't want to marry your brother. I wanted you to go home and talk to him. Who would have thought that you would bring him to the prince's manor today? Don't think I don't know what your family is thinking. I'm afraid you want to use this opportunity to make a name for yourself at the poetry meet, so that—" She stopped talking and waved her sleeve angrily. Seeing her expression, Fan Ruoruo sighed inwardly. She realized that these young ladies saw things just as her brother had said. They were extremely simple. "Who do you want me to talk to? Father or brother? You know that for people like us, marriage is not something we can decide for ourselves." Yi Ling'er bit her lip and spoke with a glimmer of hope. "Why don't you let your brother leave the capital?" Fan Ruoruo frowned and looked at her. She realized that what Yi Ling'er was saying was absurd and laughable. She had no idea that she might have been influenced by Fan Xian, which made her appear much more mature. But Yi Ling'er was still the same noble girl who did not know the sufferings of the world. "Don't talk nonsense like that." Yi Ling'er looked at her and laughed coldly. "Who is your brother? And who is my sister Lin?" Fan Ruoruo smiled. "My brother has no parents, and your sister Lin has no parents." "Who are they? And what are they?" Although the young lady of the Lin family was the Prime Minister's illegitimate daughter, the Prime Minister did not dare to acknowledge her. He could not acknowledge her. As for her mother, it was a secret the kingdom of Qing dared not speak of, so it was not wrong to say that she had no parents. Yi Ling'er seemed to have never imagined that Fan Ruoruo would say something so sharp. Her lips trembled with anger. Lowering her voice, she said fiercely, "Do you think this marriage is settled? Who knows what will happen in the future?" Fan Ruo's heart trembled slightly, but her face was still full of a gentle smile. She took a slow step forward, closing the distance between her and Yi Ling'er. She replied in an oppressive tone, "Perhaps you don't know my brother very well, but I advise you not to do anything inappropriate. As for this marriage, I don't think it's settled. Perhaps after my brother sees the young lady of the Lin family that you care so much for, he'll immediately flee the capital." Although Yi Ling'er was a martial artist who had been passed down in her family, in front of this delicate woman, her imposing manner gradually diminished. "Your brother dares to be so picky about Chener?" Fan Ruoruo sighed. Her expression was very much like Fan Xian's at times. "I just don't understand. This is a matter between Fan Manor and her family. Why are you so anxious?" Yi Ling'er thought for a moment, then lowered her posture. "You know that Sister Lin's health is not very good. Since that's the case, why go against her wishes and marry someone she doesn't want to marry?" These words pierced Fan Ruoruo's heart. What young girl did not want to fall in love? What young girl did not want to marry the person she wanted to marry? Putting herself in Fan Ruoruo's shoes, Fan Ruoruo knew that Miss Lin, who was powerless to control her own love, was indeed rather pitiful. But this matter should be decided by the adults first, and then by my brother's opinion. There's nothing I can do, Miss Yi. She smiled in response to this last sentence. At that moment, Princess Rojia, worried about the conflict between them, came out of the pavilion to look for them. Seeing that they seemed to be fine, she couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. "Let's go back," she said sweetly. Fan Ruoruo's eyes suddenly became calm. "Miss Yi," she said softly, "I hear that your friend is in poor health. It just so happens that my father knows a famous doctor. Would it be convenient for you to visit her at her manor?" Chapter 68. Yi Ling'er was the only daughter of Yi Zhong, the commander of the capital garrison. Unfortunately, her family was all about martial arts, so she did not have a gentle and refined personality. With Yi Luyun, one of the 4 great grandmasters, as her granduncle, the Yi family had a special position in the kingdom of Qing. But this young girl was not a tyrannical or unreasonable person. She just felt sorry for the Lin sisters, who spent every day on their sickbeds and were forced to marry a man she had never met, so she was a bit worried. A few days ago, there was a rumor circulating among the nobles of the capital that the palace was preparing to marry Miss Lin to the illegitimate son of Fan Manor in Danzhou. When the news came out, Miss Lin was both ashamed and angry. She caught a cold that night and coughed up blood. Her illness worsened. Yi Ling'er had been with her brother in Dingzhou, but when she heard the news, she rushed back to the capital. It was the scene Fan Xian had seen outside the city gates. A few days later, there was a rumor in the capital that the illegitimate son of Fan Manor had returned to the capital. Just like the young master of Fan Manor, Fan Xijia, he was a hedonistic hedonist. This news made Yi Ling'er even angrier. She had gone to see Miss Lin the day before, and found that she was slightly embarrassed. After questioning her, she guessed that Miss Lin had someone in mind, even though she did not get anything out of her. She couldn't bear to see her sisters sad, so she asked her father to plead with the palace to break off the marriage. Who would have guessed that her father would be so angry? She had no choice but to invite Fan Ruo to the manor to see if there was a way to delay the marriage. She knew it wasn't possible, but she had to try. Only then would she be able to fulfill her sisterly bond. Yi Ling'er looked at Wuxia, the gentle girl, and then at Fan Ruo. Her eyes were calm. Only now did she realize that Miss Ruo, who had always been known for her tranquility, was actually a formidable person. Hearing that she wanted to introduce a famous doctor, she said lightly, "There is no need." Fan Ruo did not stop there. She smiled. "If you really care about the young lady, what is there to fear about having that famous doctor take a look? Even the imperial doctors have no good ideas." "That famous doctor you speak of?" Yi Ling'er forced herself not to show her disdain in front of the princess. Fan Ruo explained politely, "That doctor is Sir Fei's student." Yi Ling'er's eyes lit up. She stepped forward and took Fan Ruo's hand. "Then I'll have to trouble you, sister." After chatting, the 3 of them returned to the pavilion. The rest of the girls saw that the 2 young ladies looked calm and thought that the matter had been resolved. Only then did they breathe a sigh of relief. There were maids and old women attending to them, and there was also a female official who had already copied the poems and sent them across the lake. After a short while, the poems of the gifted scholars on the other side of the lake were also copied over. The girls flipped through them and occasionally sighed in admiration. Fan Ruo propped her chin on her hand and looked across the lake. No one knew what she was thinking. Yi Ling'er thought of that person, and curiously took the scroll. She flipped through it, but did not see any signature by the surname Fan. "Where is Master Fan's poem?" she asked in surprise. She thought that since the Fan Manor had the man come to the manor to make a name for himself, then there was no reason for them to hide it. Master Fan did not compose a poem. So what, so what? Princess Wuxia looked at Fan Ruo, who was standing by the railing. A trace of bewilderment appeared on the girl's innocent face, and she asked what had happened. It was only now that the girls in the pavilion realized that the battle of tongues on the other side of the lake was no less intense. Princess Wuxia smiled sweetly. "Sister Ruo, why don't you come and see the poems of the gifted scholars?" As the girls discussed, Fan Ruo had heard everything. She knew that her brother had been humiliated on the other side of the lake. She turned her head from the railing, a trace of anger hidden in her calm eyes. "These people can write poems," she said coldly. Although the girls had always known that Miss Fan was proficient in the art of poetry, they were still surprised to hear her say such things. Fan Ruoruo turned around and picked up a thin brush by the side of the inkstone. She waved it over the paper and wrote a few lines. After it was dry, she handed it to the female official. "Send these 2 poems over," she ordered. The female official accepted her order and left. 2 flowers bloom, 1 on each side. On the other side of the lake, Guobaoquan had secretly revealed Fan Xian's identity. Everyone was silent, and the atmosphere was a little strange. A trace of anger flashed in Crown Prince Jing's eyes. He felt that the Crown Prince's subordinates had no sense of propriety. He clenched his fists and wondered whether or not he should teach them a lesson. But looking at Fan Xian, he felt that Fan Xian must have a way to deal with it, and that he didn't need to do anything. Count Sinan had asked Fan Xian to attend the poetry meet for a simple reason. He wanted him to make a name for himself and seize the first prize for entering the capital in order to move the heart of the eldest princess. But Fan Xian didn't seem anxious at all. It was hard to tell what he was thinking. Not long after the poems were delivered to the pavilion by the lake, a female librarian replied and handed the poem written by Miss Fan to the Crown Prince. Crown Prince Jing glanced at it, and his eyes lit up. "Good," he blurted. Beside him, the advisor moved closer and read it carefully. He nodded his head repeatedly. "It is indeed not bad, but..." He felt that this poem was written by a woman, and there was something wrong with it. But he remembered the relationship between the Fan family and the Junwang family, so he stopped talking. Everyone was curious, and gathered around to see the words written on the paper in small, elegant characters. "The lake in August is level, and the emptiness is blurry. The steam of dreamy cloud lake shakes the city of Danzhou. If one wants to help without a boat, it is a shame to be wise. Sitting and watching the fishermen envy the fish." Good poem. No wonder it was written by Miss Fan. He Zonwei was among them, and his voice of praise was particularly loud, as if it could reach the other side of the lake. She writes about the lake with ease, and talks about nature. It is truly a good piece. Guo Baoquan frowned. There's only a small lake in front of us, and it doesn't seem appropriate to use steam. Besides, Dreamy Cloud Lake is in the south, and Danzhou is by the sea. Miss Fan only wrote beautiful words, but the word nature is lacking. Crown Prince Jing, on the other hand, saw something else in the poem. There was a saying in the poem, "If you wish to help, there is no boat or oar. It is shameful to be a sage. Sitting and watching the angler, there is only envy for the fish." Although it was vague, it still revealed the author's unwillingness to be a hermit, and his desire to achieve something. It was a common practice in poetry. He turned his head to look at Fan Xian, who had been sitting quietly in a remote corner. But the poem was good, so everyone praised it, and not many agreed with Guo Baoquan. As the Crown Prince was thinking, someone had already transferred their opinion to the other side of the lake, and Miss Fan's explanation had arrived. The lake is water, and so is the sea. From Dreamy Cloud Lake to the East Sea, my brother's body sits in Danzhou, and his heart is in the sea. Why not use it as you please? This poem was written by my brother when he was 10 years old. Today, I have copied it, just to invite everyone to read it. The first part of the sentence was ignored, but it made it clear that this poem was not written by Miss Fan, but by Fan Xian, who had been silent all this time. At this moment, the scholars in the garden looked at Fan Xian, no longer with disdain and complexity, but with shock and confusion. To be able to write such a poem at the age of 10, was Fan Xian a genius? Chapter 69. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Countless gazes fell upon Fan Xian. He smiled shyly and cupped his hands in salute. He did not put on a flowery headscarf and pretend to be an artist. After all, he was Fan Xian, not Fan Wei. Seeing him like this, the Crown Prince almost laughed. He did not believe what Miss Fan had said. A 10-year-old might be able to write a good poem, but such a careful and measured tribute poem was unlikely. He guessed that Fan Xian had written it the night before and had Ruoruo bring it out on purpose, so that he could shock the world at the poetry conference. He did not dislike this. On the contrary, he found it interesting that someone as carefree as Fan Xian could write such a poem. Fan Xian did not know what the Crown Prince was thinking. He only knew that this poem, written by Meng Haoran in his previous life to flatter Zhang Jiuling, was of a higher standard than the people present, so he was satisfied. At least he had fulfilled his father's request. Guo Baokuan looked at the gazes of the crowd and was furious. He had never imagined that this embroidered pillow would have such a life-saving poem. He was not willing to let it go. He laughed coldly. "Brother Fan, what other good poems do you have? After all, this is your masterpiece when you were 10. It was clear from his words that he did not believe that the poem was written by himself. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. Why did people always like to force him to do such things? When it came to composing poems, who in this world could be his match? After all, he was possessed by the 3 gods of Li, Du, and Su, and had 5,000 years of poetic experience. He smiled. "I never write essays with a topic." Guo Baokuan looked at his fearless appearance and gritted his teeth. "Then please, Brother Fan, write as you please. Let the scholars of the capital see." Fan Xian frowned and looked coldly at the annoying fellow. He threw down a poem, got up, and left the garden. Led by the servants of the manor, he went to the latrine. As soon as the poem was spoken, the whole garden was shocked. It was like falling flowers and flowing water, sweeping away an army of 1,000. After a round of applause, the crowd was still savoring the taste. Guo Baokuan's face was green and white, and he did not know what to say. At this moment, the Crown Prince no longer cared about how to hold the fan in his hand so that he would not fall for Fan Xian's criticism of his strength of character. With a snap, he closed the fan and recited, "The wind is strong, the apes howl mournfully, the white birds fly back on the clear sand. Boundless trees rustled down, and an endless river surged forth. 10,000 miles of sorrowful autumn is often a guest, 100 years of illness alone on the stage. Hardship and bitterness hate the thick frost on the temples, dejected and destitute the wine cup. Sorrowful, clear, boundless, endless, 10,000 miles, autumn, guests, 100 years, illness, loneliness, the sorrow of eternity, all in a cup of muddy wine. Good poem, good poem." The Crown Prince exclaimed in admiration. Suddenly, he thought of his father, who looked carefree on the outside but was actually depressed on the inside. He did not know why, but his heart ached. He shook his head and remained silent for a long time. It was only after a long time that he came to his senses. Fan Xian was young. Although his life was wretched, how could he say that his hair was sickly? This was really inexplicable, it didn't make any sense at all. But everyone was still immersed in the atmosphere of the poem. Looking at the setting sun, whether it was the rich or the poor, they all felt that life was impermanent, and that sorrow was always present. So the crowd inadvertently forgot that Fan Xian's life experience did not match the heaviness of the poem. No one suspected that it was written by someone else. After all, this poem could not have been written by anyone other than a great master of poetry. If it was a great master, he would not even be willing to write for the emperor, let alone a child of the Fan family. With this poem, it doesn't matter if Master Fan never writes poetry again. Crown Prince Jing sighed. The scholars by the lake were all silent. They knew that no matter what, they could not come up with a better poem today. So the entire poetry gathering sank into silence because of Fan Xian's poem. They did not notice that the author had long since slipped away. Actually, this poem was not suitable for the occasion, nor was it suitable for the occasion. But Fan Xian was really impatient, so he hurriedly recited a poem to defeat his enemy. Impatient, on the one hand, was because of that bastard Guobaokuan. On the other hand, he was really impatient. He had been bored earlier, so he had drunk a little too much wine. Holding his pants up, he came out of the bathroom and sighed comfortably. He fastened his belt, took a towel from a servant, and wiped his hands. On the way back, he suddenly saw a nursery that was growing very pleasantly, with tender green leaves and fragmented flowers. Under the tall trees, in the twilight, there was a sense of vitality. Fan Xian turned around and asked the servant if he could go take a look. Of course, the servant knew that this was the eldest son of Fan Manor. Miss Fan and young Master Xia had always walked around the manor as they pleased, so naturally they would not say no. They respectfully replied, "No problem." Fan Xian was a little happy. He sent the servant away and walked into the nursery himself. He casually looked around and found that this garden did not have the exotic flowers and plants that rich families liked. Instead, there were many plants that he did not know the names of. They all looked very crude, and were probably wild vegetables or crops. He was a little curious. This King Jing's home was really different, to have grown so many things. Walking casually in the garden, the sky was actually still very bright, but there were trees overhead, so it seemed more secluded. You could hear the cheerful chirping of birds returning to their nests above your head. Surrounded by green, it was very comfortable. Fan Xian was very happy to be rid of that boring poetry gathering. He hummed a little tune as he walked deeper into the garden. As he walked, he smiled and thought to himself, "I won't be like Duan Yu and meet a fairy sister, will I?" "Who are you?" A person stood up from among the plants and looked at Fan Xian curiously. Fan Xian was shocked. Even with his hearing, he had only noticed this person when he was so close. If this person was an assassin, then he was doomed. Only then did he realize that after entering the capital, he had become much less vigilant. He looked at the person in front of him and laughed at himself. Of course, this person could not be Wang Yuyan, nor could it be the white-clothed woman that he could not forget. It was a gardener in his 40s or 50s. He held a hoe in his hand and had a mud basket at his feet. His face was fair, but there was a slight panic in his eyes. He must have seen Fan Xian's clothes and was a little afraid. Fan Xian smiled slightly and bowed to the gardener. "I must have startled you. I am a guest of the prince's manor and happened to pass by. I saw that the garden was well kept, so I decided to take a look around." The old gardener wiped his hands on his clothes, as if he did not know how to greet him. Hearing Fan Xian praise the garden, he laughed in a simple and honest manner. Chapter 70. Fan Xian looked around and found that there was no one around, so he simply found a rock and sat down. He took the water bottle the old gardener handed him and drank a few mouthfuls, casually chatting with him about growing flowers and grass. He basically knew nothing about this area, so listening to the gardener's exuberant explanation was somewhat refreshing. However, after listening for a while, he became a little annoyed. He wanted to leave, but when he thought of the poetry meet that was even more annoying, he gave up and sighed. Hearing the young master sigh, the gardener asked curiously, "Why aren't you happy? The poetry conference in the prince's manor is very boring." Fan Xian blinked at him, thinking that the gardener was only a servant, so there was no way he would be interested in the poetry conference. Sure enough, the gardener nodded solemnly. Reciting poetry is something only idle people do. It's not like they can earn a living. What a bunch of stupid pigs. Fan Xian was startled. Wasn't he scolding himself as well? Soon after, a thought flashed through his mind, and he laughed out loud, "You really are a stupid pig." He finally understood some things, and waved off the matter of reciting poems. After the poetry conference was over, everyone went home or ran away. As for what happened next, it was not until the next day that the news spread throughout the capital. That night, at King Jing's manor, the crown prince had planned to go to the Drunken Immortal Tavern to have some fun, but he was invited back by the old housekeeper. He sat uncomfortably at the table, waiting with his sister for their father's lecture. King Jing sat at the head of the table. It was the old gardener that Fan Xian had chatted with that afternoon in the nursery. He looked down at his arrogant son and cursed out of nowhere, "You stupid pig. You only go to those places every day." Crown Prince Li Hongqing knew that "stupid pig" was his father's catchphrase, so he did not get angry. He smiled bitterly. "Why are you angry today, father?" King Jing snorted, but did not continue his outburst. He asked, "Did you have that poetry conference again today?" Li Hongqing was startled, then smiled bitterly. He knew that his father did not like the business of scholars, but he had to help the second prince win over scholars in the capital. To his surprise, King Jing did not get angry. Instead, he asked with interest, "There was a young man at the poetry conference today. He was wearing a light maroon robe. Whose family was he?" Li Hongqing thought to himself, "There are so many people here today, how can I remember all of them?" Imperial Prince Jing frowned, as if he was thinking about that person's characteristics. After a while, he said, "That lad is very pretty, like a girl." Li Hongqing chuckled. He knew who his father was talking about, and quickly replied, "You must be talking about the one in Fan Manor." Imperial Prince Jing raised his eyebrows and revealed a hint of ferocity. He roared, "What? You say he's Fan Jian's son in Danzhou? I'll *ck his mother. How could someone like Fan Jian have such a beautiful son?" Princess Rojia blushed when she heard her father swear. However, she was also very interested to see what kind of person the man that Ruoruo treated like a teacher was. Li Hongqing looked at his father angrily, thinking that it was fortunate that there were no servants nearby. But then he thought about it and realized that the servants were used to King Jing's mouth. He quickly asked, "Father, why are you asking about the boy?" "Why?" Imperial Prince Jing snorted. After running into Fan Xian in the afternoon, who didn't know who he was, he thought he looked familiar, but he couldn't quite place him. And because Fan Xian disliked poetry gatherings, he was able to listen to him talk about the arts that he was most proud of. But he didn't expect that the pretty boy was Fan Jian's son. Anger rose in his heart, and he continued to lecture him. "You should learn from that. What's his name?" "Fan Xian. Learn from Fan Xian. Don't be fooled by his unorthodox background, but he has good taste." King Jing sighed. He looked at his son and lectured him, "Fan Xian is able to talk to a gardener for half a day. You, on the other hand, are too proud of your status. You should know that being proud is not suitable for what you are doing right now." Crown Prince Li Hongqing knew that he was on good terms with the second prince. Of course, he couldn't hide it from his father, who was outwardly loyal and irascible, but was actually very astute. After the meal, the crown prince was about to return to his study to read in order to cheer his father up. Unexpectedly, King Jing said after a long pause, "Weren't you going to the Drunken Immortal Tavern?" The Drunken Immortal Tavern was not a restaurant, but a brothel. The difference of one word was like the difference between heaven and earth. The crown prince's heart tightened, and he hurriedly said that he didn't dare. King Jing stared into his eyes and scolded him. "You're a man. If you want to go, then go. Don't be so irresponsible." Having said this, he called for someone to kick him out. Li Hongqing sat in the private room of the Drunken Immortal Tavern, holding the most popular courtesan in the capital, Yuan Meng. He was still thinking coldly about why his father had suddenly changed today. Late at night, in King Jing's manor, King Jing drank and cursed. That son of a bitch loved to go to brothels, and he actually gave birth to such a beautiful child. I'll let my son go there as well, so he can have a beautiful grandson in the future. Putting aside the matter of King Jing forcing his son to go to brothels, Fan Xian waited until the poetry meeting was over. He climbed into a sedan chair early and met up with Teng Zijing and a few guards. After the poetry meeting was over, everyone was talking about the Fan family's poem. Seeing the Fan Manor sedan chair, some scholars came up to bid farewell. Fan Xian hurriedly got down and sent them off with a smile. He then ordered the guards to take Ruoruo back to the manor. Before Ruoruo got into the sedan chair, she nodded to him. Fan Xian knew that the matter had been settled. His spirits lifted, he began to make arrangements for the evening. Guo Baokuan must be living in the manor of the Minister of State. He goes to the palace every 3 days or so. It's called editing, but in reality, he's the Crown Prince's study companion. Fan Xian frowned. How old is the Crown Prince this year? He needs a study companion? The Crown Prince is the Empress's son. He's ranked 3rd among the princes, and he's already 18 years old. Fan Xian laughed. Why would an 18-year-old need a study companion? Teng Zijing laughed bitterly. He's just having fun, so he's found some people to play with him. Does the emperor not care? That. I'm not sure. After what happened in the restaurant a few days ago, Fan Xian was worried that Guo Baokuan would not be able to swallow his anger and would do something underhanded. So he ordered Teng Zijing to investigate, and found out where Guo Baokuan often went, as well as the route he took home. At today's poetry meeting, Guo Baokuan's words were sharp. No matter how good Fan Xian's temperament was, he could only keep a smile on his face. Deep down, he was still very angry. Only now did he realize that the reason he had asked Teng Zijing to investigate was because he was subconsciously prepared to bully Guo Baokuan, not because he was worried about being bullied. Chapter 71. What's the saying again? Fan Xian looked at Teng Zijing. Teng Zijing followed up quickly, I die. Nonsense, I get nothing out of your death. Of course I want someone else dead. You know what to do, right? Teng Zijing agreed without hesitation, even though he knew that beating Guo Baokuan in public would be a serious offense, not to mention Guo Baokuan's relationship with the Crown Prince. He was the son of a minister. If Count Sinan did not intervene, Teng Zijing, as the mastermind, would have to flee the capital for many years. But he still agreed without hesitation, because he believed that by following this young man in front of him, he would definitely be able to escape from this kind of mediocre life in the future. This confidence came from many aspects, including young Master Fan's knowledge, manner of speaking, and temperament, as well as Teng Zijing's intuition. Fan Xian nodded, very satisfied with his attitude, but said something strange, you don't know what to do. Teng Zijing was a little surprised, not understanding what the young master meant. I have to beat him, or else how can I vent my anger? Fan Xian smiled warmly, but this bright smile made Teng Zijing shiver, as usual. But I have to think of how to beat him. Who will beat him? How can I beat him to my heart's content without worrying about being flogged by the authorities? Originally, I didn't want to dirty my hands by beating him up, but if you or your family guards beat him up, it won't be easy to talk to the officials in the future. I believe father won't offend the Guo family for a few servants. Fan Xian continued to explain with a smile, if I do it, my status is different, and the consequences will be much lighter. The marriage between the Fan and Lin families is imminent, and father and the noblemen in the palace are determined to make it happen. They can't let anything happen to me. Teng Zijing frowned. Young master, you must not do it yourself. Besides, a fight between the nobles in the capital is a small matter. If you involve the master and Fan Manor support in the palace, it would be a bit. Teng Zijing stopped talking, but Fan Xian continued. A bit of a loss for a small gain? A bit of a mischief? He smiled and shook his head. I'm just saying if. In reality, I'm not going to beat him and then give him a chance to bite back. Teng Zijing felt a chill in his heart. Was this young master going to commit murder? Fan Xian guessed what he was thinking. He laughed and did not explain. Have you invited Crown Prince Jing? He asked. Please. Where should I book it? Drunken Immortal Residence. The name of this restaurant is quite elegant. Young master, this is a brothel. Fan Xian was taken aback. He forced a smile and agreed. Have you prepared the sacks? To the west of the capital was the Lujing River. Before this river flowed into the Tsang Mountains, it gradually slowed down, forming a large pool of water that was as clear as a mirror. Every night, many pleasure boats would travel casually on the surface of the lake. The boats were decorated with lanterns and streamers, and they were as dazzling as crystal palaces. It was extremely beautiful. The commoners all knew what they did for a living. However, as time went on, not many people would point fingers at them. The Drunken Immortal Residence was not the largest of the brothels, but it was of the highest class. It was a 2-story ship, exquisitely beautiful and elegantly decorated. Most importantly, it was the most popular girl in the capital's brothel scene, Sea Lily. Sea Lily's appearance and temperament went without saying. She was also skilled in the 4 arts of the zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting. She was also proficient in playing the zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting. Although she did not have much skill, she had earned a reputation as a talented woman from the capital's talented scholars, intentionally or otherwise. Of course, this was not the only reason that had allowed this girl to rise so quickly in the capital's show scene and become the center of attention. To a greater extent, it was because of a certain rumor. It was said that Lady Lily's surname was not Si, but Li, the surname of the royal family. The rumors in the Jianghu said that this girl was a descendant of the royal family at the beginning of the country, but because her ancestor had committed a major crime, she had fallen to this state. Those who truly understood the royal family would naturally scoff at such rumors. The common people actually knew that the news was definitely false, but Sea Lily never explained, so they simply went with the flow. In any case, His Majesty the Emperor would not care about the surname of a prostitute. This kind of mentality was actually easy to explain. Just think about the officials who worked in the court every day. If they knew that the wonderful person tossing and turning under them was a distant relative of His Majesty, they would probably be much happier. That was why the Drunken Immortal Residence was very, very popular and very expensive, but it was still very lively every night. Who knew how many fools were willing to spend a lot of money to become Miss Lily's guest? But today, it was a little strange. The pleasure boat was anchored by the shore, but those young masters were not allowed to board. A few fierce-looking men were guarding the gangplank, and they almost got into a conflict with those people. Fortunately, the madam came down to explain, and those young masters found out that the Drunken Immortal Residence had been booked by someone today. How much would it cost to book the Drunken Immortal Residence? The young masters, who loved to take advantage of the situation, left resentfully. They couldn't help but secretly curse the person who booked the Drunken Immortal Residence for being a spendthrift. Fan Xian looked at the exquisite pastries on the table and drank the fine wine handed to him by a pair of slender hands. He really did feel like a spendthrift. Although the money had been paid by Teng Zijing from the accounts office of Count Sinan's manor, and although his father was in charge of the kingdom of Qing's money, the accounts office of Fan Manor was like a small account office of the kingdom of Qing. But when Fan Xian thought of the amount of money he would have to spend today, he still felt his heart ache. Furthermore, he didn't know how his father would react if he found out that he had used public money to visit a brothel, so he felt a little uneasy. The source of his uneasiness also came from the girl in his arms. Sea Lily's eyebrows were like willow leaves, and her dark eyes roamed about. Her lips were like painted vermilion, and when they gently opened and closed, they naturally revealed a kind of charm. Most importantly, sitting in Fan Xian's arms, every inch of her body made Fan Xian a little dazed. Feeling the heartbeat of the handsome young master beneath her getting faster and faster, Lily secretly smiled. After confirming that the young master of Fan Manor was indeed a fledgling, she stopped teasing him and got out of his arms. She poured him a cup of wine, brought it to his lips, and took a sip. Chapter 72. The boat slowly left the riverbank, and the girls slowly left Fan Xian. Fan Xian let out a sigh of relief when he saw the soft, wonderful woman in his arms sit down next to him. After all, he had been a virgin for more than 30 years. Suddenly encountering this kind of stimulation was a bit unbearable. Seeing his expression, Lily was a little curious. In this day and age, rich and powerful young masters like him would have fooled around with the servants in the manor at the age of 13 or 14. It was rare to see someone like him. She had no idea that Fan Xian had grown up in Danzhou and had only had a few servant girls. Donger, whom he had fantasized about, had long since married. Later, when he was about to fool around with Cici, he had been urgently summoned to the capital. Lily looked at Fan Xian's handsome face, and for a moment she was lost in thought. She blushed and silently placed some food on his plate. This was the first time in his 2 lives that Fan Xian had entered a brothel, so he was a bit nervous. Naturally, he had no experience. Seeing that she was silent, he thought that the brothel girls of the kingdom of Qing served people in such a manner, so he said nothing. His left hand, whether intentionally or not, lingered on Lily's waist. The atmosphere immediately warmed up. In another cabin, however, it was very lively. Teng Zijing was drinking with a few of his trusted subordinates. The brothel keeper stood to one side and asked if they wanted a girl to keep them company. The subordinates seemed to be tempted, but Teng Zijing coldly shook his head. They had been with the young master for a few days and had never had a chance to show off their skills. Today was a rare opportunity, and they refused to waste their time by drinking. Seeing his insistence, the brothel keeper did not insist. She had already given them the money, so she cheerfully poured them wine and chatted with them. The brothel keeper's surname was also Si, but it was obviously fake. Her first name was Ling, and she was no more than 30 years old. She was still attractive, and her words were quick and efficient. After a few cups of wine, she whispered in Teng Zijing's ear, "Sir, you are a handsome man. Which family do you work for?" This was obviously a probe, and Teng Zijing laughed. "When we made the reservation, we made it clear that our young master is the eldest son of Fan Manor." Ling smiled charmingly. The Fan clan is one of the 5 great clans of the capital. They don't have a dozen manors, but at least 3 or 4 of the most luxurious. Teng Zijing chuckled but did not reply. Ling's heart skipped a beat, and he probed, "Such a generous person, it must be Assistant Minister Fan's family?" Teng Zijing naturally would not deny that they were purposely going to the brothel today. He nodded. Ling was shocked. "So you are the son of Count Sinan?" She was still a little puzzled. Since he was the young master of Count Sinan, then the handsome young man sitting with her daughter in the rear cabin must be the illegitimate son of Fan Manor that everyone had been talking about recently. How could such an outsider son command Fan Manor so much money? Of course, she would not ask these questions. She only smiled and thought to herself. Back when she was grooming her cage and receiving guests, she had heard from her elder sisters that Count Sinan Fan Jian was a frequent visitor to the brothels of the capital. Even after his marriage, he would often linger on the river. Even the censors had repeatedly submitted memorials to censure him. But because of his friendship with His Majesty, there was nothing they could do. Who would have thought that after 20 years, Count Sinan's son would once again spend a fortune on flowers? When she saw the young master of the Fan family, she knew that he was a beginner in this field. Si Ling secretly sighed in admiration. This was his first time seeking pleasure, and he had found the most popular girl in his family. This was truly a family tradition. As they spoke, a few red lanterns suddenly appeared on the riverbank. It seemed that someone was shouting something in their direction. The madam stood up, somewhat hesitant. Teng Zijing's eyes were sharp, and he immediately recognized the guards of King Jing's manor. He quickly ordered the pleasure boat to approach the riverbank to receive them. After Crown Prince Jing boarded the ship, he naturally went to the rear cabin. Si Ling's brothel keeper was shocked when she saw him. Why did they invite this young master? It seemed that young Master Fan in the rear cabin had quite a bit of influence. The Crown Prince's guards were familiar with Teng Zijing and went to drink. In the rear cabin, Crown Prince Jing saw Fan Xian's frightened expression and couldn't help but mock him. Miss Lily isn't going to eat people. Why are you hiding so far away? Fan Xian thought that if he hadn't come, he would have started eating people. Why did you come so late, Crown Prince? Crown Prince Jing, Li Hongqing, was startled. Was he supposed to tell him that his father had taught him a lesson because of him? He chuckled. You're from Danzhou, so you don't know the rules of the capital. You usually come out to enjoy the night view after you've finished eating at home. Enjoying the night view was a clever phrase, but there were no such rules. Fan Xian knew that, but he didn't expose him. He smiled and drank with him. Strangely, he and Crown Prince Jing had only met 3 times, including this time, but both of them felt that their temperaments were somewhat compatible. Crown Prince Jing didn't have the domineering air of a relative of the royal family, and Fan Xian wasn't as vulgar as other nobles. He was free and at ease in front of Crown Prince Jing, which suited Li Hongqing's temperament perfectly. After a few cups of wine, the two of them became familiar with each other. The Crown Prince seemed to be very interested in his life in Danzhou, and Fan Xian picked out a few things that weren't so strange, such as the mirage. There was only Si Lily in the room, and she was a little restless. She didn't know who to serve. Although she knew that young Master Fan had paid for the boat, Crown Prince Jing's status was so noble. What if young Master Fan wanted her to serve the Crown Prince? Li Hongqing looked at the girl with a smile. Although he often hung out in brothels, he had seen Lily before. Unfortunately, he hadn't had anything to do with her. Seeing her troubled expression, although he knew that she was deliberately pretending to be wronged, his heart softened. He motioned for her to sit next to Fan Xian. Of course, the procuress wouldn't let the Crown Prince just sit there. She had already invited a girl from a nearby pleasure boat. Her name was Yuan Meng, and she was also a very popular courtesan on Lujing River. She and Si Lily sat at the small table, one on the left and the other on the right. They were a fitting match for the Crown Prince and young Master Fan. As the wine grew stronger and the night grew darker, Crown Prince Jing and Fan Xian grew closer. They were both very satisfied with this meeting. Seeing the bright moon in the sky shift, the two looked at each other and smiled. They each took their beauties back to their cabins. The red candles gradually lit up. Si Lily's eyes were like silk. She gently leaned against Fan Xian's chest, her fingers gently tickling his palm. Her breath was like orchids. Fan Xian calmly took out a wax pill from his sleeve and gently crushed it. Si Lily smiled and fell asleep. The cabin was filled with the fragrance of the knockout drug. Chapter 73. The pleasure boat stopped by the shore. Crown Prince Jing stood by the side of the boat, smiling as he watched the group disappear into the night. Yuan Meng was in his arms. Where did Master Fan go? She asked curiously. The Crown Prince tapped the tip of her cold nose. You still want to pretend to be innocent in front of me? Yuan Meng smiled sweetly. No matter what Master Fan went to do, he didn't hide it from you. I'm afraid Si Lily doesn't know anything. He didn't hide it from me. That means he's smart. Li Hongqing smiled. I'm just a shield he pulled along. But if he wants me to do it willingly, he can't hide it from me. He suddenly asked, what do you think Fan Xian thinks of Sea Lily? Yuan Meng seemed to be very familiar with the crown prince. After thinking for a moment, she replied, Master Fan seems to like Sea Lily very much. I just didn't expect him to be able to endure this unrequited love and go do something else. She covered her mouth and laughed. It was completely different from her usual demeanor. Then you should keep in touch with Sea Lily. Perhaps Fan Xian will come to the Drunken Immortal Tavern often. Li Hongqing frowned. Yes. Yuan Meng agreed like a subordinate. She was curious as to why the crown prince was so interested in Fan Xian. Li Hongqing put his hand into her clothes. Yuan Meng let out a soft cry. Her body almost went limp. Do you know who Fan Xian is? He's the favorite illegitimate son of Minister Fan Jian of the Ministry of Revenue. Yuan Meng's voice was like a kitten's, but her eyes were very clear. I understand. You want to control the kingdom of Qing's money. Li Hongqing smiled and shook his head. I don't have that ambition. I just think Fan Xian is a friend worth making. What he said was true, but there were some things he didn't make clear. Li Hongqing knew about Fan Lin's secret marriage, so he knew that the young man named Fan Xian would one day manage the huge business system behind the royal family. If the second prince wanted to compete with the crown prince, then money was the most important weapon. Guo Baoquan was at a disadvantage at the poetry meet and was in a very bad mood. That was why he went to a party at night to ease his mood a little. Once he thought of his old-fashioned father at home, his mood became bad again. Just as he was planning what fun things to bring to the palace for the crown prince the next day, he noticed that the sedan had stopped. He wasn't prepared for it, and he didn't know why, but his head was a little dizzy. His forehead bumped into the front, and it hurt. He angrily cursed, "You bastards, how can you carry the palanquin?" No one answered him. It was quiet outside the sedan chair. Guo Baoquan awkwardly climbed out of the almost toppled sedan chair and found that the street was quiet. It was Niulan Street, which he had to pass before returning to the mansion. There were 3 masked men in black surrounding the sedan chair, and the Guo residence's sedan chair bearers and guards were already lying on the ground. It was unknown whether they were dead or alive. Guo Baoquan thought he had run into thieves who were robbing him along the way and was scared half to death. When did the security in the capital become so bad? Trembling, he shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" Niulan Street had always been quiet, especially at night. There were basically no pedestrians, and Guo Baoquan felt a little hopeless. He didn't expect anyone to come and save him by shouting, so he kept his voice low. A clear and gentle voice answered, "I'm Fan Xian, and I want to hit you." Guo Baoquan turned his head in shock, only to find a gunny sack flying toward him and covering him, so he didn't see Fan Xian's hateful smiling face. There was a faint fragrance in the gunny sack, but it caused Guo Baoquan's dizzy mind to sober up a lot. However, this made him even more miserable, because what followed next was a torrential beating. Punches and kicks were actually merciless. Fan Xian watched Ting Zijing and the others beat him, and felt a little pleased. He just wanted to let others know that they shouldn't try to provoke him so easily, but he also had other intentions. Guo Baoquan was the son of a minister, and he had never suffered such humiliation and pain. But he knew that it was Fan Xian who was beating him. In a fight between the sons of nobility, there was no possibility of killing. Knowing that he wouldn't lose his life, he spoke harshly. "Little bastard Fan. Beat me to death if you dare." Hearing this, Fan Xian was enraged. He waved his hand, motioning for Ting Zijing and the others, who had been beating him silently, to move aside. He walked over, squatted down, and gave Guo Baoquan a good beating. Then he spoke softly to the rolling gunny sack, "Brother Gua, do you know why I wrote that poem this afternoon?" Fan Xian's strength was great, and Gua Baokuan was in so much pain that he couldn't speak, and could only whimper. "The wind is strong, the ape howls mournfully, the white bird flies back on the clear sand. Boundless trees rustle down, the endless river rolls in. 10,000 miles of sorrowful autumn is always a guest, 100 years of sickness alone on the stage. Hardship, bitterness, hatred, and frost hairs on the temples. Destitute, new and cloudy wine cups. You've bullied me twice, so I'm going to beat you until you're sad and sickly. Otherwise, how can I be happy?" As soon as he finished speaking, his fist smashed into Gua Baokuan's face through the gunny sack. He didn't know how he could be so accurate in the middle of the night, but he hit Gua Baokuan squarely on the bridge of his nose. Gua Baokuan felt a wave of pain, numbness, and itchiness rush to his brain. Blood flowed, and he couldn't help but wail and cry, begging for mercy. Fan Xian looked at the writhing gunny sack on the ground, and only then did he realize that his cruel and merciless side seemed to be slowly breaking free from the disguise he'd been hiding all these years. Still not satisfied, he kicked the gunny sack a few times, then waved his hand and led the 3 thugs behind him away into the night. He had come in a hurry, and left in a hurry. Gua Baokuan hated not seeing him again. Half a day later, Gua Baokuan crawled out of the gunny sack, his body covered in bruises. Looking at the guards and sedan bearers lying on the ground, he couldn't help but curse and kick them up. Only now did he realize that his subordinates had been drugged, but that despicable Fan Xian had put the antidote in the gunny sack and beat him until he wished he were dead. The guards held Gua Baokuan's groggy head. Seeing their young master beaten into a pig's head, they were scared half to death. They rushed to help him up, not even sitting in the sedan, and carried him back to Gua Manor. That night, Gua Manor was in chaos. Early the next morning, Gua Baokuan sent someone to the capital government and handed the complaint to Mei Zhili, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Appointments and the capital government's magistrate. Mei Zhili complained about the previous night's tragedy, and swore that the bastards of Fan Manor would be punished with heavy crimes, and that the audacious bastard son of the Fan family would not be spared. If even Mei Zhili couldn't punish him, how could he, as a minister, face? You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.